Sviazhsky was prévôt-dityel, or marshal of the nobility in his district. He was 5 years older than Levin and had been married some time. His sister-in-law was an intimate of his family, and to Levin she was a very attractive young lady, and Levin knew that Sviazhsky and his wife would be very glad for him to marry her. He knew this infallibly, as marriageable young men usually know such things, and he knew also that though he dreamed of marriage, and was sure that this fascinating young lady would make a charming wife, he would sooner have been able to fly to heaven than to marry her, even if he had not been in love with Kitty Shtcherbatsky. And this knowledge poisoned his pleasure in his prospective visit. On receiving Sviazhsky's letter, with his invitation to go hunting, Levin had immediately thought about this, but in spite of it, decided that such views in regard to him on the part of Sviazhsky were entirely gratuitous, and he decided to accept the invitation. Moreover, he had in the depths of his soul a strong curiosity to see this girl once more and experiment on the effect that she would produce on him. Sviazhsky's domestic life was in the highest degree pleasant, and Sviazhsky himself was the very best type of the proprietor devoted to the affairs of the province, and this fact always interested Levin. He was one of those men that always excited Levin's amazement, whose opinions, very logical, although never self-formed, take one direction, while their lives, perfectly defined and content in their course, take another, absolutely independent of each other and almost always in opposition. Sviazhsky was a thoroughgoing liberal. He despised the nobility, charged the majority of the nobles with secretly, and from motives of cowardice, opposing emancipation, and he regarded Russia as a rotten country like Turkey, and its government so wretched that he did not permit himself seriously to criticize its acts. And yet he had accepted public office and attended faithfully to his duties. He never even went out without donning his official cap, with its red border and cockade. He declared that human existence was endurable only abroad, where he was going to live at the first opportunity, but at the same time he carried on in Russia a very complicated estate in the most perfect style, and was interested in all that was going on in Russia, and was fully up with the times. The Russian muzhik, in his eyes, stood between man and monkey, but, when the elections came, he gave his hand to the peasants by preference, and listened to them with the utmost attention. He believed neither in God nor in the devil, but he showed great concern in the questions concerning ameliorating the condition of the clergy, and the diminution of the revenues, and moreover, he labored with especial zeal to have his village church kept in repair. In regard to the complete emancipation of woman, and especially her right to work, he sided with the most extreme supporters of this doctrine, but he lived with his wife in such perfect harmony that though they had no children, everyone admired them, and he took entire direction of the family affairs, so that his wife did nothing, and could do nothing, except in cooperation with him, in order to pass the time as agreeably as possible. If Levin had not been naturally disposed to see the best side of people, the analysis of Sviazhsky's character would have caused him no trouble or question. He would have said to himself, "Fool," or "good for nothing," and that would have been the end of it. But he could not say "fool," "durak," because Sviazhsky was undoubtedly not only very clever, but also very cultivated and an extraordinarily simple-hearted man, entirely free from conceit. There was no subject which he did not know, but he displayed his knowledge only when it was needed. Still less could he say that he was a good-for-nothing, because Sviazhsky was unquestionably an honorable, excellent, sensible man, who was always doing his work cheerfully and alertly, and had apparently never intentionally done anything wrong or could do anything wrong. Levin tried to comprehend and could not understand him, and always looked at him and his life as a living enigma. He and Levin had been friends, and therefore Levin allowed himself to study Sviazhsky, and tried to trace his view of life to the very source. But this was always an idle task. Every time Levin made the effort to penetrate a little further into the hidden chambers of Sviazhsky's mind, he discovered that the man was somewhat confused. A sort of terror showed itself in his eyes, as if he feared that Levin was going to entrap him, and he would give him a good-natured and jolly rebuff. Now, after his disenchantment on the subject of farm management, Levin was especially glad to be at Sviazhsky's. To say nothing of the fact that he was always pleasantly impressed by the sight of these doves so contented with themselves and all they possessed, and their comfortable nest, he had a great longing, now that he was so dissatisfied with his own life, to discover the secret of his having such clear, decided, and cheerful views of life. Moreover, Levin knew that he should meet at Sviazhsky's the proprietors of the neighborhood, and he was especially desirous to talk with them, to hear about their experiences in farm management, about their crops, their way of hiring service, and the like, which, as Levin knew well, it was the fashion to regard as very trifling topics of conversation, but which seemed to him more important than anything else. Perhaps these things were not important during the days of serfdom, or in England. In both those cases conditions are definitely fixed. But with us at the present time, when everything has been overturned and the new order is only just begun, the question how to regulate these conditions is the only important one in Russia. Such was Levin's conviction. The hunting which Sviazhsky gave him was poorer than Levin had expected. The marshes were dry and the woodcock scarce. Levin walked all day and bagged only 3 birds. But in compensation he brought back with him as always from hunting a ravenous appetite, capital spirits, and the intellectual excitement which violent physical exercise always gave him. Even when he was out hunting, while, as it would seem, his thoughts were not busy about anything, he kept remembering the old man and his family, and the impression remained with him that there was some peculiar tie between himself and that family. In the evening, at the tea-table in the company of 2 proprietors who had come on some business with the marshal, the interesting conversation that he had looked forward to soon began. At the tea-table Levin sat next to the hostess and had to keep up a conversation with her and her sister who sat opposite him. His hostess was a moon-faced lady of medium stature and light complexion, all radiant with smiles and dimples. Levin endeavored, through her, to unravel the enigma which her husband's character offered him, but he could not get full control of his thoughts, because opposite him sat the pretty sister-in-law, in a gown worn, as it seemed to him, for his especial benefit, with a square corsage cut rather low in front, giving a glimpse of a very white bosom. This décolleté gown, in spite of the fact that the bosom was very white, or perhaps from the reason that it was very white, stopped the free flow of his thought. He could not help imagining, though of course erroneously, that this display was made for his benefit, and yet he felt that he had no right to look at it, and he tried not to look at it, but he was conscious of being to blame for her wearing such a gown. It seemed to Levin that he was deceiving some one, that he ought to make some kind of an explanation, but that it was an utter impossibility to do it, and so he kept blushing and felt ill at ease, and his constraint communicated itself to the pretty young lady. But the hostess seemed not to notice it, and kept up a very lively conversation. "You say that my husband does not take an interest in Russian affairs?" she asked. "On the contrary, he was happy when he was abroad, but not so happy as he is here. Here he feels that he is in his sphere. He has so much to do, and he has the faculty of interesting himself in everything. Oh, you've not been to see our school, have you?" "Yes, I have. That little house covered with ivy." "Yes, it is Nastia's work," said she, glancing at her sister. "Do you yourself teach?" asked Levin, trying to look at Nastia's face, but feeling that, in spite of himself, he would see the low corsage. "Yes, I teach, and intend to keep on teaching. But we have an excellent schoolmistress, and we have gymnastics." "No, thank you. I will not take any more tea," said Levin. He felt he was committing a solecism, but he could not keep up the conversation, and he rose in confusion. "I am very much interested in what they are saying," he added, and went to the other end of the table, where the host was talking with the 2 landed proprietors. Sviazhsky was sitting with his side toward the table, twirling his cup around with one hand, and with the other stroking his long beard and lifting it up to his nose, and dropping it again as if he were smelling it. His bright black eyes were fixed with a keen amusement on one of the proprietors, a man with a white moustache, who was complaining bitterly about the peasantry. Levin saw that Sviazhsky had an answer ready for the worthy gentleman's comical complaints, and could reduce his arguments to powder if his official position did not compel him to respect the proprietors. The proprietor with the white moustache was evidently a narrow-minded country gentleman, an inveterate opponent of the emancipation, and an old-style farmer. Levin could see the signs of it in his old-fashioned, shiny coat, in his keen, angry eyes, in his well-balanced Russian speech, in his authoritative, slow, and studied manner, and his imperious gestures with his large, handsome, sunburnt hands, on one of which for sole ornament was an old-fashioned wedding ring. Chapter 26. If only it weren't a pity to abandon what has been done, cost so much labor. It would be better to give up, sell out, go abroad, and hear La Belle Helene, like Nikolai Ivanovitch, the old proprietor was saying, while his intelligent face lighted up with a pleasant smile. There now, but still you don't sell out, said Nikolai Ivanovitch Sviazhsky. So you must be well off on the whole. I am well off in one way, because I have a home of my own, with board and lodging. Besides, one always hopes that the peasantry will improve. But would you believe it? This drunkenness, this laziness, everything goes to destruction. No horses, no cows. They starve to death. But try to help them. Take them for farm hands. They manage to ruin you. Yes, even before a justice of the peace. But you, too, can complain to the justice of the peace, said Sviazhsky. What? I complain? Not for all the world. All such talk shows that complaints are idle. Here, at the mill, they took their handsaw and went off. What did the justice of the peace do? Acquitted them. Your only chance is to go to the communal court, to the starshina. The starshina will have the man thrashed for you. He settles things in the old-fashioned way. If it were not for him, you had better sell out, fly to the ends of the world. The proprietor was evidently trying to tease Sviazhsky, but Sviazhsky not only did not lose his temper, but was much amused. Well, we carry on our estates without these measures, said he, smiling. I, and Levin, and he. He pointed to the other proprietor. Yes, but ask Mikhail Petrovitch how his affairs are getting along. Is that a rational way? Demanded the proprietor, especially accenting the word rational. My way is very simple, said Mikhail Petrovitch. Thank the Lord. My whole business lies in seeing that the money is ready for the autumn taxes. The moujiks come and say, Batyushka, help us, father. Well, all these moujiks are neighbors. I pity 'em. Well, I advance 'em the first third. Only I say, remember, children, I help you, and you must help me when I need you, sowing the oats, getting in the hay, harvesting. Now I get along with them as with my own family. To be sure, there are some among them who haven't any conscience. Levin, who knew of old about these patriarchal traditions, exchanged glances with Sviazhsky, and interrupting Mikhail Petrovitch, he said, How would you advise? Addressing the old proprietor with the grey moustache. How do you think one's estate ought to be managed? Well, manage it just as Mikhail Petrovitch does. Either give half the land to the moujiks, or go shares with them. That is possible. But, all the same, the wealth of the country is growing less and less. Places on my lands, which in the old time of serfage, under good management, produced ninefold, now produce only threefold. Emancipation has ruined Russia. Sviazhsky looked at Levin with smiling eyes, and even made a scarcely noticeable gesture to express his disdain. But Levin did not find the old proprietor's words ridiculous. He understood them better than he understood Sviazhsky. Much that the old man said in his complaint, that Russia was ruined by the emancipation, seemed to him true. For him it was novel and unanswerable. The proprietor evidently expressed his honest thought, a thought which arose not from any desire to show an idle wit, but from the conditions of his life, which had been spent in the country, where he could see the question practically from every side. The fact is, please to acknowledge, continued the old proprietor, who evidently wished to show that he was not an enemy of civilization. All progress is accomplished by force alone. Take the reforms of Peter, of Catherine, of Alexander. Take European history itself. Still more so for progress in agriculture. The potato, for instance. To introduce potatoes into Russia required force. We have not always ploughed with iron ploughs. Perhaps they have been introduced into our domains, but it required force. Now, until recently, when we had control over our serfs, we proprietors could conduct our affairs with all sorts of improvements, drawing-rooms and winnowing machines and dung-carts, all sorts of tools, we could introduce because we had the power, and the moujiks at first would oppose and then would imitate us. But now, by the abrogation of serfage, they have taken away our authority, and so our estates, now that everything is reduced to the same level, must necessarily sink back to the condition of primitive barbarism. This is my view of it." "Yes, but why? If that were rational, then you could keep on with your improvements by aid of hired labour," said Sviazhsky. "We have no power. How could I, allow me to ask?" This is the working force, the chief element in the problem before us," thought Levin. "With hired men." "Hired men will not work well, or work with good tools. Our labourers know how to do only one thing, to drink like pigs, and, when they are drunk, to ruin everything you entrust them with. They water your horses to death, destroy your best harnesses, take the tires off your wheels, and sell them to get drunk, and stick bolts into your winnowing machines so as to render them useless. Everything that is not done in their way is nauseous to them, and thus the affairs of our estates go from bad to worse. The lands are neglected and go to weeds, or else are abandoned to the moujiks. Instead of producing millions of tchverts of wheat, you can raise only a few 100,000. The public wealth is diminishing. If they were going to free the serfs, they should have done it gradually." And he developed his own scheme of emancipation, whereby all these difficulties would have been avoided. This plan did not interest Levin, but when the gentleman had finished he returned to his first proposition, with the hope of inducing Sviazhsky to tell what he seriously thought about it. He said, addressing Sviazhsky, "It is very true that the level of our agriculture is growing lower and lower, and that in our present relations with the peasantry, it is impossible to carry on our estates rationally," he said. "I am not of that opinion," said Sviazhsky, seriously. "I only see that we are not up to the point of managing our estates, and that on the contrary, since serfage was abolished, agriculture has decayed. I argue that in those days it was very wretched and very low. We never had any machines, or good oxen, or decent supervision. We did not even know how to make up our accounts. Ask a proprietor. He could not tell you what a thing cost, or what it would bring him." "Italian bookkeeping," said the old proprietor, ironically. "Reckon all you please, and get things mixed as much as you please. There will be no profit in it." "Why get things mixed up? Your miserable flail, your Russian topchachek, will break all to pieces. My steam thresher will not break to pieces. Then your wretched nags, how are they? A puny breed that you can pull by the tails comes to nothing. But our Petcherons are vigorous horses. They are worth something. And so with everything. Our agriculture always needed to be helped forward." "Yes, but it would need some power, Nikolai Ivanovitch. Very well for you, but when one has one son at the university and several others at school, as I have, he can't afford to buy Percherons." "There are banks on purpose." "To have my last goods and chattels sold under the hammer. No, thank you." "I don't agree that it is necessary or possible to lift the level of agriculture much higher," said Levin. "I am much interested in this question, and I have the means, but I cannot do anything. As for banks, I don't know whom they profit. Up to the present time, whatever I have spent on my estate has resulted only in loss. Cattle, loss. Machines, loss." "That is true," said the old proprietor with the grey moustache, laughing with hearty satisfaction. "And I am not the only man," continued Levin. "I call to mind all those who have made experiments in the rational manner. All, with few exceptions, have come out of it with losses. Will you admit that your farming is profitable?" he asked, and at that instant he detected in Sviazhsky's face that transient expression of embarrassment which he noticed when he wanted to penetrate further into the inner chambers of Sviazhsky's mind. However, the question was not entirely fair play on Levin's part. His hostess had told him at tea that they had just had a German expert up from Moscow, who, for 500 rubles fee, agreed to put the bookkeeping of the estate in order, and he found that there had been a net loss of more than 3,000 rubles. She could not remember exactly how much, but the German accountant had calculated it to within 40 kopecks. The old proprietor smiled when he heard Levin's question about the profits of Sviazhsky's management. It was evident that he knew about the state of his neighbor's finances. "Maybe it is unprofitable," replied Sviazhsky. "This only proves that either I'm a poor manager, or I sink my capital to increase the revenue." "Oh, revenue!" cried Levin with horror. "Maybe there is such a thing as revenue in Europe, where the land is better for the labor spent on it. But with us, the more labor spent on it, the worse it is. That is because it exhausts it. So there is no revenue." "How, no revenue? It is a law." "Then we are no exceptions to the law. The word renta, revenue, has no clearness for us, and explains nothing, but rather confuses. No, tell me how the doctrine of revenue can be." "Won't you come have some curds? Masha, send us some curds or some raspberries," said Sviazhsky to his wife. "Raspberries have lasted unusually late this year." And with his usual jovial disposition of soul, Sviazhsky got up and went out, evidently assuming that the discussion was ended, while for Levin it seemed that it had only just begun. Levin was now left with the old proprietor, and continued to talk with him, endeavoring to prove to him that all the trouble arose from the fact that we did not try to understand our laborers' habits and peculiarities. But the old proprietor, like all people accustomed to think alone and for himself, found it difficult to enter into the thought of another, and clung firmly to his own opinions. He declared that the Russian muzhik was a pig and loved swinishness, and that it needed force or else a stick to drive him out of his swinishness. But we are such liberals that we have suddenly swapped off the 1,000-year-old stick for these lawyers and jails, where the good-for-nothing, stinking muzhik gets fed on good soup and has his pure air by the cubic foot. "Why," asked Levin, wishing to get back to the question, "do you think that it is impossible to reach an equilibrium which will utilize the forces of the laborer and render them productive?" "That will never come about with the Russian people. There is no force," replied the proprietor. "Why, could not new conditions be found?" asked Sviazhsky, who had been eating his curds and smoking a cigarette, and now approached the two disputants. "All the needful forms are ready for use, and well learned. That relic of barbarism, the primitive commune where each member is responsible for all, is falling to pieces of its own weight. The right of holding serfs has been abolished. Now there remains only free labor, and its forms are at hand, the day laborer, the journeyman, the ordinary farmer. And you can't get rid of this." "But Europe is discontented with these forms." "Yes, and perhaps discontent will find new ones, and will progress probably." "This is all I say about that," said Levin. "Why should we not seek for them on our side?" "Because it would be much the same as our pretending to invent new methods of constructing railways. Our methods are all ready. All we have to do is to apply them." "But if they do not suit us, if they are hurtful?" Levin insisted. And again he saw the frightened look in Sviazhsky's eyes. "Well, this. We throw up our caps, we follow wherever Europe leads. All this I know, but tell me, are you acquainted with all that is going on in Europe about the organization of labor?" "No, I know very little." "This question is now occupying the best minds in Europe. Schultz Delitzsch and his school, then all this prodigious literature on the labor question, the tendencies of Lassalle, the most radical of all of them, the Mühlhausen organization, this all is a fact, you surely must know." "I have an idea of it, but it's very vague." "No, you only say so. You know all this as well as I do. I don't set up to be a professor of social science, but these things interest me. And I assure you, if they interest you, you should go into them." "But where do they lead you?" "Beg pardon?" The two proprietors got up, and Sviazhsky, again arresting Levin in his disagreeable habit of looking into the inner chambers of his mind, went out to bid his guests good-bye. Chapter 27. Levin spent the evening with the ladies and found it unendurably stupid. His mind was stirred, as never before, at the thought that the dissatisfaction he felt in the administration of his estate was not peculiar to himself, but was a general condition to which affairs in Russia had evolved, and that an organization of labor, whereby the work would be carried on in such a manner as he saw at the muzhiks on the highway, was not an illusion, but a problem to be solved. And it seemed to him that he could settle this problem, and that he must attempt to do it. Levin bade the ladies good night, promising to go with them the following morning for a ride to visit some interesting spots in the Crown Woods. Before going to bed, he went to the library to get some of the books on the labor question which Sviazhsky had recommended. Sviazhsky's library was an enormous room, lined with bookshelves, and having two tables, one a massive writing table standing in the center of the room, and the other a round one, laden with recent numbers of journals and reviews in different languages, arranged about a lamp. Near the writing table was a cabinet, stiolka, containing drawers inscribed with gilt lettering for the reception of various documents. Sviazhsky got the volumes and sat down in a rocking chair. "What is that you are looking at?" he asked of Levin, who was standing by the round table and turning the leaves of a review. Levin held up the review. "Oh, yes, that is a very interesting article indeed. It argues," he continued with gay animation, "that the principal culprit in the partition of Poland was not Frederick after all. It appears," and he gave with the clearness characteristic of him a digest of these new and important discoveries. Although Levin was now more interested in the question of farm management than in anything, he asked himself, as he listened to his friend, "What is he in reality? And why does the partition of Poland interest him?" When Sviazhsky had finished, Levin could not help saying, "Well, and what of it?" But he had nothing to say. It was interesting simply from the fact that it argued. But Sviazhsky did not explain, and did not think it necessary to explain, why it was interesting to him. "Well, but the irascible old proprietor interested me very much," said Levin, sighing. "He's sensible, and a good deal of what he says is true." "Ah, don't speak of it. He is a confirmed slaveholder at heart, like the rest of them." "With you at their head." "Yes, only I am trying to lead them in the other direction," replied Sviazhsky, laughing. "His argument struck me very forcibly," said Levin. "He is right when he says that our affairs, that is, the rational management, cannot succeed, that the only kind that can succeed is the money-lending system like that of the other proprietor, or, in other words, the one that is the simplest. Who is to blame for this?" "We ourselves, of course. But then it is not true that it does not succeed. It succeeds with Vassilchikov." "The mill." "But still I don't know what surprises you about it. The peasantry stand on such a low plane of development, both materially and morally, that it is evident they'll oppose everything that is strange to them. In Europe the rational management succeeds because the people are civilized. In the first place, we must civilize our peasantry. That's the point." "But how will you civilize them?" "To civilize the people 3 things are necessary: schools, schools, and schools." "But you yourself say the peasantry stand on a low plane of material development. What good will schools do you in that respect?" "Do you know, you remind me of a story of the advice given to a sick man. You had better try a purgative. He tried it and grew worse. Apply leeches. He applied them and grew worse. Well, then, pray to God. He tried it, he grew worse. So it is with you. I say political economy, you say you're worse for it. I suggest socialism, worse still. Education, still worse." "Yes, but how can schools help?" "They will create other needs." "But this is the very thing I could never understand," replied Levin vehemently. "In what way will schools help the peasantry to better their material condition? You say that schools, education, will create new needs. So much the worse, because they will not have the ability to satisfy them, and I could never see how a knowledge of addition and subtraction and the catechism could help them to better themselves materially. Day before yesterday I met a peasant woman with a baby at the breast, and I asked her where she was going. She said she had been to the babka's. The child had a crying fit, and I took him to be cured. I asked, how did the babka cure the crying fit? She set him on a hen roost and muttered something. "Well there," cried Sviazhsky, laughing heartily. "You yourself confess it. In order to teach them that they can't cure children by setting them on hen roosts, you must—" "Ah, no," interrupted Levin, with some vexation. "Your remedy of schools for the people I only compared to the Babka's method of curing. The peasantry are poor and uncivilized. This we see as plainly as the woman saw her child's distress because he was crying. But that schools can raise them from their wretchedness is as inconceivable as the hen roost cure for sick children. You must first remedy the cause of the poverty." "Well, in this at least you agree with Spencer, whom you do not like. He says that civilization can result from increased happiness and comfort in life, from frequent ablutions, but not by learning to read and cipher." "There now, I'm very glad, or rather very sorry, if I am in accord with Spencer. But this I have felt for a long time. Schools cannot help. The only help can come from some economical organization, whereby the peasantry will be richer, will have more leisure. Then schools also will come." "Nevertheless, schools are obligatory now all over Europe." "But how would you harmonize this with Spencer's ideas?" asked Levin. But into Sviazhsky's eyes again came the troubled expression, and he said with a smile, "No, the story of the crying fit was capital. Is it possible that you heard it yourself?" Levin saw that there was no connection between this man's life and his thoughts. Evidently it was perfectly indifferent to him where his conclusions led him. Only the process of reasoning was what appealed to him, and it was disagreeable to him when this process of reasoning led him into some stupid, blind alley. This was what he did not like, and he avoided it by leading the conversation to some bright and agreeable topic. All the impressions of this day, including those which arose from his visit to the old music, and which seemed somehow to give a new basis to his thoughts, troubled Levin profoundly. This genial Sviazhsky, who kept his thoughts for general use and evidently had entirely different principles for the conduct of his life, keeping them hidden from Levin, while at the same time he and the majority of men, the throng whose name is Legion, seemed to be ruled by the general consensus of opinions by means of ideas strange to him. The testy old proprietor, perfectly right in his judicious views of life, but wrong in despising one entire class in Russia, and that perhaps the best. His own discontent with his activity, and the confused hope of setting things right at last, all this excited and disturbed him. Levin retired to his room and lay down on his springy mattress, which unexpectedly exposed his arms and legs every time he moved. But it was long before he could get to sleep. His conversation with Sviazhsky, though many good things were said, did not interest him, but the old proprietor's arguments haunted him. He involuntarily remembered every word that he said, and his imagination supplied the answer. "Yes, I ought to have replied to him. You say that our management is not succeeding because the music despises all improvements, and that force must be applied to them. But if our estates were not retrograding, even where these improvements are not found, you would be right. But advance is made only where the laborer works in conformity with his own customs, as at the old man's by the roadside. Our general dissatisfaction with our management proves that either we or the laborers are at fault. We have long been losing, both by our own methods and by European methods, by neglecting the qualities of the laboring force. Let us be willing to acknowledge that the laboring force is not ideal as a force, but is the Russian music with his instincts, and we shall then be able to manage our estates in conformity with this," I should have said to him. "Imagine that you were carrying on an estate like that of my old man by the roadside, that you had found a way of interesting your laborers in the success of their work, and had found that by means of improvements, such as they would acknowledge to be improvements, you had succeeded in doubling or trebling your returns without exhausting the soil. Then suppose you make a division and give a half to your working force. The residue which you would have would be larger, and that which would come to the working force would be larger. But to do this there must be a coming down from anything like ideal management, and the laborers must be interested in the success of the management. How can it be done? This is a question of details, but there is no doubt that it is possible." This idea kept Levin in a state of agitation. Half the night he did not sleep, thinking of the details connected with carrying out his new plans and schemes. He had not intended to leave so soon, but now he decided to go home on the morrow. Moreover, the memory of the young lady with the open dress came over him with a strange sense of shame and disgust. But the main thing that decided him was his desire to lay before his musics his new project before the autumn harvests, so that they might reap under the new conditions. He decided to reform his whole method of administration. End of chapter 28. The carrying out of Levin's plan offered many difficulties, but he persevered, and finally succeeded in persuading himself without self-deception that the enterprise was worth the labor, even though he should not succeed in doing all that he wanted to do. One of the principal obstacles which met him was the fact that his estate was already in running order, and that it was impossible to come to a sudden stop and begin anew, but that he had to remodel his machine while it was going. When he reached home in the evening, he summoned his overseer and explained to him his plans. The overseer received with undisguised satisfaction all the details of this scheme, as far as they showed that all that had been done hitherto was absurd and unproductive. The overseer declared that he had long ago told him so, but that no one would listen to him. But when it came to Levin's proposition to share the profits of the estate with the labourers, on the basis of an association, the overseer put on an expression of the deepest melancholy, and immediately began to speak of the necessity of bringing in the last sheaves of wheat, and commencing the second ploughing, and Levin felt that now was not a propitious time. On conversing with the muzhiks about his project of dividing with them the products of the earth, he found that here his chief difficulty lay in the fact that they were too much occupied with their daily tasks to comprehend the advantages and disadvantages of his enterprise. A simple-minded muzhik, Ivan the herdsman, seemed to comprehend and to approve Levin's proposal to share with him the profits of the cattle. But whenever Levin went on to speak of the advantages that would result, Ivan's face grew troubled, and, without waiting to hear Levin out, he would hurry off to attend to some work that could not be postponed, either to pitch the hay from the pens, or to draw water, or to clear away the manure. Another obstacle consisted in the inveterate distrust of the peasants, who would not believe that a proprietor could have any other aim than to get all he could out of them. They were firmly convinced, in spite of all he could say, that his real purpose was hidden. They, on their side, in expressing their opinions, had much to say, but they carefully guarded against telling what their actual object was. Levin came to the conclusion that the irate proprietor was right in saying that the peasants demanded, as the first and indispensable condition for any arrangement, that they should never be bound to any of the new agricultural methods or to use the improved tools. They agreed that the new-fashioned plough worked better, that the weed extirpator was more successful, but they invented 1,000 reasons why they should not use them, and, although he had made up his mind that there must be a coming down from anything like ideal management, he felt deep regret to give up improvements the advantages of which were so evident. But in spite of all these difficulties, he persevered, and by autumn the new arrangement was in working order, or at least seemed to be. At first Levin intended to give up his whole domain, just as it was, to the muzhiks, the labourers, and overseer on the new conditions of association. But very soon he found that this was impracticable, and he made up his mind to divide the management of the estate. The cattle, the garden, the kitchen garden, the hay-fields, and some lands fenced off into several lots were to be reckoned as special and separate divisions. Ivan, the simple-minded herdsman, who seemed to Levin better fitted than anyone else, formed an artel, or association, composed of the members of his family, and took charge of the cattle yard. A distant field, which for 8 years had been lying fallow, was taken by the shrewd carpenter, Fyodor Ruzanov, who joined with him 7 families of muzhiks, and the muzhik-shuraev entered into the same arrangements for superintending the gardens. All the rest was left as it had been, but these 3 divisions constituted the beginning of the new arrangement, and they kept Levin very busy. It was true that matters were not carried on in the cattle yard any better than before, and that Ivan was obstinate in his opposition to giving the cows a warm shelter, and to butter made of sweet cream, asserting that cows kept in a cold place required less feed, and that butter made of sour cream was made quicker, and he demanded his wages as before, and he was not at all interested in the fact that the money that he received was not his wages, but his share of the profits of the association. It was true that Ruzanov and his associates did not give the fields a second ploughing, as they had been advised to do, and excused themselves on the ground that they had no time. It was true that the muzhiks of this company, although they had agreed to take this work under the new conditions, called this land, not common land, but shared land, and the muzhiks and Ruzanov himself said to Levin, "If you would take money for the land, it would be less bother for you, and that would let us out." Moreover, these muzhiks kept putting off under various pretexts the building of the cattle yard and barn, and did not get it done till winter, though they had agreed to build it immediately. It was true that Shureyev tried to exchange for a trifle with the muzhiks the products of the gardens which he had undertaken to manage. He evidently had a wrong notion, and a purposefully wrong notion, of the conditions under which he had taken the land. It was true that often, in talking with the muzhiks and explaining to them all the advantages of the undertaking, Levin was conscious that all they heard was the sound of his voice, that they were firmly convinced that they were too shrewd to let him deceive them. He was especially conscious of this when talking with the cleverest of the muzhiks, Ruzanov. He noticed in the man's eye a gleam which betrayed evident scorn for Levin, and a firm conviction that if anyone was to be cheated it was not he, Ruzanov. But, in spite of all these drawbacks, Levin felt that he was making progress, and that if he rigorously kept his accounts and persevered, he should be able to show his associates at the end of the year that the new order of things could bring excellent results. All this business, together with his work in connection with the rest of his estate, which still remained in his own hands, and together with his work in the library on his new book, so filled his time during the summer that he scarcely ever went out, even to hunt. Toward the end of August he learned through the man that had brought back the saddle that the Oblonskys had returned to Moscow. By not having replied to Darya Alexandrovna's letter, by his rudeness which he could not remember without a flush of shame, he felt that he had burnt his ships, and he never again could go to them. In exactly the same way he owed apologies to Sviazhsky for having left his house without bidding him good-bye. Neither would he again dare to go to Sviazhsky's. But now all this was a matter of indifference to him. He was more interested and absorbed in his new scheme of managing his estate than in anything that he had ever attempted. He finished the books which Sviazhsky had lent him, and others on political economy and socialism which he had sent for. In the books on political economy, in Mill, for example, which he studied first with eagerness, hoping every minute to find a solution of the questions which occupied him, he found laws deduced from the position of European husbandry, but he could not see how these laws could be profitably applied to Russian conditions. He found a similar lack in the books of the socialist writers. Either they were beautiful but impracticable fancies, such as he dreamed when he was a student, or modifications of that situation of things applicable to Europe, but offering no solution for the agrarian question in Russia. Political economy said that the laws by which the wealth of Europe was developed and would develop were universal and fixed. Socialistic teachings said that progress according to these laws would lead to destruction. But neither school gave him any answer or as much as a hint on the means of leading him and all the Russian muzhiks and agriculturalists, with their millions of hands and of destians, to more successful methods of reaching prosperity. As he was already involved in this enterprise, he conscientiously read through everything that bore on the subject and decided in autumn to go abroad and study the matter on the spot, so that he might not have with this question the experience that had so often met him with various questions in the past. How many times in a discussion he had just begun to understand his opponent's thought and to expound his own, when suddenly the question would be asked, "But Kaufmann, Jones, Dubois, Mitchell, you have not read them? Read them. They have worked out this question." He saw clearly now that Kaufmann and Mitchell could not tell him anything. He knew what he wanted. He saw that Russia possessed an admirable soil and admirable workmen, and that in certain cases, as with the muzhik by the roadside, the land and the laborers could produce abundantly, but that in the majority of cases when capital was spent upon them in the European manner, they produced little, and that this resulted entirely from the fact that the laborers liked to work, and work well only in their own way, and that this contrast was not the result of chance, but was permanent and based on the very nature of the people. He thought that the Russian people, which was destined to colonize and cultivate immense unoccupied spaces, would consciously, until all these lands were occupied, hold to these methods as necessary to them, and that these methods were not so bad as they were generally considered. And he wanted to demonstrate this theoretically in his book, and practically on his estate. End of chapter 29. Toward the end of September, the lumber was brought for the construction of a barn on the Artel land, and the butter was sold, and showed a profit. The new administration, on the whole, worked admirably in practice, or at least it seemed so to Levin. But in order to explain the whole subject into a clear light theoretically, and to finish his treatise, which Levin imagined was likely not only to revolutionize political economy, but even to annihilate this science, and to make the beginnings of a new one, treating of the relations of the peasantry to the soil, he felt that it was necessary to go abroad, and to learn, from observation on the spot, all that was going on in that direction, and to find conclusive proofs that all that was done there was not the right thing. He was only waiting for the delivery of the wheat to get his money and make the journey. But the autumn rains set in, and portions of the wheat and potatoes were not as yet garnered. All work was at a standstill, and it was impossible to deliver the wheat. The roads were impracticable, 2 mills were washed away by the freshet, and the weather kept growing worse and worse. But on the morning of October 12th the sun came out, and Levin, hoping for a change in the weather, began resolutely to prepare for his journey. He sent the overseer to the merchant to negotiate for the sale of the wheat, and he himself went out for a tour of inspection of the estate, in order to make the last remaining arrangements for his journey. Having accomplished all that he wished, he returned at nightfall, wet from the rivulets that trickled from his waterproof down his neck and inside his high boots, but in a happy and animated frame of mind. Toward evening the storm increased. The hail pelted so violently the drenched horse that she shook her ears and her head and went sideways. But Levin, protected by his bashlyk, felt comfortable enough, and he cheerfully gazed around him, now at the muddy streams running down the wheel tracks, now at the raindrops trickling down every bare twig, now at the white spots where the hail had not yet melted on the planks of the bridge, now at the dry but still pulpy leaf clinging with its stout stem to the denuded elm. In spite of the gloomy aspect of nature, he felt in particularly good spirits. His talks with the peasants in a distant village convinced him that they were beginning to get used to his new arrangements, and an old dvornik, at whose house he stopped to dry himself, evidently approved of his plan and wanted to join the association for the purchase of cattle. "What is required is to go straight to my goal, and I shall succeed," thought Levin. "But the labor and the pains have an object. I am not working for myself alone, but the question concerns the good of all. The whole way of managing our estates, the condition of all the people must be absolutely changed. Instead of poverty, universal well-being, contentment. Instead of enmity, agreement and union of interests. In a word, a bloodless revolution, but a mighty revolution, beginning in the little circuit of our district, then reaching the province of Russia, the whole world. The conception is so just that it cannot help being fruitful. Yes, indeed, this goal is worth working for, and there is absolutely no significance in the fact that I, Kostya Levin, my own self, a man who went to a ball in a black necktie and was rejected by Shtcherbatsky, am a stupid and a good-for-nothing. That is neither here nor there. I believe that Franklin felt that he was just such a good-for-nothing, and had just as little faith in himself when he took everything into account. And, probably, he had his Agafya Mikhailovna also, to whom he confided his secrets. With such thoughts, Levin reached home in the dark. The overseer, who had been to the merchant, came and handed him a part of the money from the wheat. The agreement with the dvornik was drawn up, and then the overseer told how he had seen wheat still standing in the field by the road, while his 160 stacks, not yet brought in, were nothing in comparison to what others had. After supper, Levin sat down in his chair, as usual, with a book, and as he read he began to think of his projected journey, especially in connection with his book. That evening the whole significance of his undertaking presented itself to him with remarkable clearness, and his ideas fell naturally into flowing periods, which expressed the essence of his thought. "I must write this down," he said to himself. "It must go into a short introduction, though before I thought that was unnecessary." He got up to go to his writing table, and Laska, who had been lying at his feet, also got up, and, stretching herself, looked at him as if asking where he was going. But he had no time for writing, for the various superintendents came for their orders, and he had to go to meet them in the anteroom. After giving them their orders, or rather having made arrangements for their morrow's work, and having received all the muzhiks who came to consult with him, Levin went back to his library and sat down to his work. Laska lay under the table. Agafya Mikhailovna, with her knitting, took her usual place. After writing some time, Levin suddenly arose and began to walk up and down the room. The memory of Kitty and her refusal, and the recent glimpse of her, came before his imagination with extraordinary vividness. "Now, there's no need of your getting blue," said Agafya Mikhailovna. "Now, why do you stay at home? You had better go to the warm springs, if your mind is made up." "I'm going day after tomorrow, Agafya Mikhailovna, but I had to finish up my business." "Your business, indeed. Haven't you given these muzhiks enough already? And they say, our baron is trying to buy some favour from the Tsar, and strange it is. Why do you bother yourself so about the muzhiks?" "I'm not bothering myself about them. I'm doing it for my own good." Agafya Mikhailovna knew all the details of Levin's plans, for he had explained them to her, and he had often had discussions with her, and had not agreed with her comments. But now she entirely misapprehended what he said to her. "For your own soul it is certainly important. To think of that is above everything," she said, with a sigh. "Here's Parfen Denisovitch. Although he could not read, may God give us all to die as he did," said she, referring to a household servant who had recently died. "They confessed him, and gave him extreme unction." "I did not mean that," said he. "I mean that I am working for my own profit. It will be more profitable to me if the muzhiks will work better." "There, you will only have your labour for your pains. The lazy will be lazy and always do things over his left shoulder. Where he has a conscience, he'll work. If not, nothing will be done." "Well, well. But don't you yourself say that Ivan is beginning to look out for the cows better?" "I say this one thing," replied Agafya Mikhailovna, evidently not at random, but with a keen logical connection of thought. "You must get married, that's what." Agafya Mikhailovna's observation about the very matter that preoccupied him angered him and insulted him. He frowned, and, without replying, sat down to his work again, repeating to himself all that he had thought about the importance of his work. Occasionally amid the silence he noted the clicking of Agafya Mikhailovna's needles, and, remembering what he did not wish to remember, he would frown. At 9 o'clock the sound of bells was heard, and the heavy rumbling of a carriage on the muddy road. "There, here's some visitors coming to see you. You won't be bored any more," said Agafya Mikhailovna, rising and going to the door. But Levin stepped ahead of her. His work did not progress now, and he was glad to see any guest. End of chapter 30. Before Levin got halfway downstairs, he heard in the vestibule the sound of a familiar cough, but the sound was covered by the noise of his own footsteps, and he hoped that he was mistaken. Then he saw the tall, bony figure which he knew so well, but even now, when there seemed to be no possibility of deception, he still hoped that he was mistaken, and that this tall man who was divesting himself of his shuba and coughing was not his brother Nikolai. Levin loved his brother, but it was always extremely disagreeable to live with him. Now especially, when Levin was under the influence of the thoughts and suggestions awakened by Agafya Mikhailovna, and was in a dull and melancholy humor, the presence of his brother was indeed an affliction. Instead of a gay, healthy visitor, some stranger who, he hoped, would drive away his perplexities, he was obliged to receive his brother, who knew him through and through, who could read his most secret thoughts, and who would oblige him to share them with him, and this he did not like to do. Angry with himself for his unworthy sentiments, Levin ran down into the vestibule, and, as soon as he saw his brother close at hand, the feeling of personal discomfort instantly disappeared, and was succeeded by a feeling of pity. Terrible as his brother Nikolai had been when he saw him before by reason of his emaciation and illness, he was now still more emaciated, still more feeble. He was like a skeleton covered with skin. He was standing in the vestibule, stretching out his long, thin neck and unwinding a scarf from it, and he smiled with a strange, melancholy smile. When Levin saw his brother's humble and pitiful smile, he felt a choking sensation. "Well, I have come to you," said Nikolai in a thick voice, and not for a second taking his eyes from his brother's face. "I have been wanting to come for a long time. Yes, I have. But I have been so ill. Now I am very much better," he added, rubbing his beard with his great bony hand. "Yes, yes," replied Levin, and it was still more terrible to him when, as he touched his brother's shriveled cheeks with his lips, he felt his fever flush, and saw the gleam of his great, strangely brilliant eyes. Some time before this, Konstantin Levin had written his brother that, having disposed of the small portion of their common inheritance, consisting of personal property, a sum of 2,000 rubles was due as his share. Nikolai said that he had come to get this money, and especially to see the old nest, to put his foot on the natal soil, so as to get renewed strength, like the heroes of ancient times. Notwithstanding his tall, stooping form, notwithstanding his frightful emaciation, his movements were, as they had always been, quick and impetuous. Levin took him to his room. Nikolai changed his dress and took great pains with his toilet, which in former times he neglected. He brushed his thin-shaven hair and went upstairs smiling. He was in the gayest and happiest humor, just as Konstantin had seen him when he was a child. He even spoke of Sergey Ivanovitch without bitterness. When he saw Agafya Mikhailovna, he jested with her, and questioned her about the old servants. The news of the death of Parfen Desinuich made a deep impression on him. A look of fear crossed his face, but he instantly recovered himself. "He was very old, was he not?" he asked, and he quickly changed the conversation. "Yes, I'm going to stay a month or two with you, and then go back to Moscow. You see, Myagkov has promised me a place, and I shall enter the service. Now I have turned over a new leaf entirely," he added. "You see, I have sent away that woman." "Marya Nikolaevna? How? What for?" "Ah, she was a wretched woman. She caused a heap of tribulations." But he did not tell what the tribulations were. He could not confess that he had sent Marya Nikolaevna away because she made his tea too weak, still less because she insisted on treating him as an invalid. "Then, besides, I want to begin an entirely new kind of life. Of course, I, like everybody else, have committed follies, but the present, I mean the last one, I don't regret it, provided only I get better, and better, thank the Lord. I feel it already." Levin listened, and tried in vain, to find something to say. Apparently Nikolai had somewhat the same feeling. He began to ask him about his affairs, and Konstantin was glad to speak about himself because he could speak without any pretense. He frankly related his plans and his experiments. Nikolai listened, but did not show the least interest. These two men were so related to each other, and there was such a bond between them, that the slightest motion, the sound of their voices, spoke more clearly than all the words that they could say to each other. At this moment both were thinking the same thought, Nikolai's illness and approaching death, dwarfing everything else into insignificance. Neither of them dared make the least allusion to it, and therefore all that either of them said failed to express what really occupied their minds, and was therefore false. Never before had Levin been so glad for an evening to end, for bedtime to come. Never, even when obliged to pay casual or official visits, had he felt so false and unnatural as that evening. And the consciousness of this unnaturalness, and his regret, made him more unnatural still. His heart was breaking to see his beloved dying brother, but he was obliged to dissemble, and to talk about various things as if his brother were going to live. As at this time the house was damp, and only his own room was warm, Levin offered to share it, with a partition between them, with his brother. Nikolai went to bed, and slept the uneasy sleep of an invalid, turning restlessly from side to side, and constantly coughing. Sometimes when he could not raise the phlegm he would cry out, "Ach, bose moi!" Sometimes when the dampness choked him, he would grow angry and cry out, "Ugh, the devil!" Levin could not sleep as he listened to him. His thoughts were varied, but they always returned to one theme, death. Death, the inevitable end of all, for the first time appeared to him with irresistible force. And death was here, with this beloved brother, who groaned in his sleep, and who called now upon God, now upon the devil. It was with him also. This he felt. If not today, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then in 30 years. Was it not all the same? And what this inevitable death was, not only did he not know, not only had he never before thought about it, but he had not wished, had not dared to think about it. Here I am working, wanting to accomplish something, but I forget that all must come to an end. Death. He was lying in bed in the darkness, curled up, holding his knees, scarcely able to breathe, so great was the tension of his mind. The more he thought, the more clearly he saw that from his conception of life he had omitted nothing except this one little factor, death, which would come and end all, and that there was no help against it, not the least. Yes, this is terrible, but it is so. Yes, but I am still alive. Now, what can be done about it? What can be done? He asked in despair. He lighted a candle and softly arose and went to the mirror, and began to look at his face and his hair. Yes, on the temples a few grey hairs were to be seen. He opened his mouth. His back teeth showed signs of decay. He doubled up his muscular arms. Yes, there's much strength, but this poor Nikolenka, who is breathing so painfully with the little that is left of his lungs, also had at one time a healthy body. And suddenly he remembered how when they were children and were put to bed, they would wait until Fyodor Bogdanuitch got out of the door, and then begin a pillow fight, and laugh so unrestrainedly that not even the fear of Fyodor Bogdanuitch could quench this exuberant and intoxicating sense of the gaiety of life. But now, there he lies in bed with his poor hollow chest, and I, ignorant why. And what will become of me? Ka! Ah! What the devil are you doing? Why don't you go to sleep? Demanded his brother's voice. I don't know. Insomnia, I guess. But I have been sleeping beautifully. I have not had any sweat at all. Just feel, no sweat. Levin felt of him. Then he got into bed again, put out the candle, but it was long before he went to sleep. Still in his mind arose this new question, how to live so as to be ready for the inevitable death. There, he is dying. Yes, he will die in the spring. How can I aid him? What can I say to him? What do I know about it? I had even forgotten that there was such a thing. Levin had long before made the observation that often people who surprise you by an abrupt transition grow unendurable by reason of their gentleness and excessive humility, unreasonableness and peremptory ways. He foresaw that this would be the case with his brother, and, in fact, Nikolai's sweet temper was not of long duration. On the very next morning he awoke in an extremely irritable temper, and immediately began to pick a quarrel with his brother by touching him on the most tender points. Levin felt himself to blame, but he could not be frank. He felt that if they had not both dissimulated their thoughts, but had spoken from their very hearts, they would have looked into each other's eyes, and he would have said only this: "You are going to die. You are going to die." And Nikolai would have answered only this: "I know that I am dying, and I am afraid. and they would have said nothing more if they had spoken honestly from their hearts. But as this sincerity was not possible, Constantine tried to do what all his life long he had never succeeded in doing, though he had observed that many persons could do it, and that without doing it life was almost impossible. He tried to talk about something that was not in his mind, and he felt that his brother divined his insincerity, and was therefore irritated and angry, and found fault with all that he said. On the third day Nikolai began to discuss the question of his brother's reforms, and to criticize them, and in a spirit of contrariety to confound his scheme with communism. You have only taken your idea from someone else, and you distort it, and want to apply it to what is not suited to receive it. Yes, but I tell you that the two have nothing in common. I have no thought of copying communism, which denies the right of property, of capital, of inheritance, but I do not disregard these stimuli. It went against Levin's grain to use these terms, but since he had begun his treatise he found himself, in spite of him, compelled to use non-Russian words. All I want is to regulate labour. In other words, you borrow a foreign idea. You take away from it all that gives it force, and you pretend to make it pass as new, said Nikolai, angrily craning his neck in his cravat. Yes, but my idea has not the slightest resemblance. This idea, interrupted Nikolai, smiling ironically, and with an angry light in his eyes, communism, has at least one attractive feature, and you might call it a geometrical one. It has clearness and logical certainty. Maybe it is utopia, but let us agree that it can make a tabula rasa of the past, so that there shall be no property of family, but only freedom of labour. But you don't accept this. But why do you confound them? I never was a communist. But I have been, and I believe that if communism is premature, it is, at least, reasonable, and it is as sure to succeed as Christianity was in the early centuries. And I believe that labour must be regarded from the scientific standpoint. In other words, it must be studied. Its constitution must be known, and... Now, that is absolutely idle. This force goes of itself, and takes different forms, according to the degrees of its development. Everywhere this order has been followed. Slaves, the métayers, free labour, and here in Russia we have the farm, the errand or leasehold, our system of apprenticeship. What more do you want? Levin took fire at these last words, the more because he feared in his secret soul that his brother was right in blaming him for wanting to discover a balance between communism and the existing forms, a thing which was scarcely possible. I am trying to find a form of labour which will be profitable for all, for me and the labourer, he replied warmly. That is not what you wish to do. It is simply this. You have, all your life long, sought to be original, and you want to prove that you are not exploiting the music, but are working for a principle. Well, since you think so, let's end it, replied Constantine, feeling the muscles of his right cheek twitch involuntarily. You never had, and you never will have, any convictions, and you only wanted to flatter your conceit. That is very well to say, but let us end the matter. Certainly I will. It was time long ago. You go to the devil, and I am sorry that I came. Levin tried in vain to calm him. Nikolai would not listen to a word, and persisted in saying that they had better separate, and Constantine saw that it was not possible to live with him. Nikolai had already made his preparations to depart, when Constantine came to him and begged him, in a way that was not entirely natural, for forgiveness if he had offended him. Ah, now, here's magnanimity, said Nikolai, smiling. If you are very anxious to be in the right, then let us agree that this is sensible. You are right, but I am going all the same. At the last moment, however, as Nikolai kissed his brother, a strange look of seriousness came on him. Kostya, he said, don't harbour any animosity against me, and his voice trembled. These were the only words which were spoken sincerely. Levin understood that they meant, you see and know that I am miserable, and we may not meet again. Levin understood this, and the tears came into his eyes. Once more he kissed his brother, but he could not find anything to say. On the third day after his brother's departure Levin went abroad. At the railway station he met Shtcherbatsky, Kitty's cousin, and astonished him greatly by his melancholy. "What is the matter?" asked Shtcherbatsky. "Well, nothing, except that there is little happiness in this world." "Little happiness? Just come with me to Paris instead of going to some place like Mulhouse. I'll show you how gay it is." "No, I am done for. I am ready to die." "What a joke!" said Shtcherbatsky, laughing. "I am just learning how to begin." "I felt the same a little while ago, but now I know that my life will be short." Levin said what he honestly felt at this time. All that he saw before him was death or its approach. But still he was just as much interested as ever in his projects of reform. It was necessary to keep his life occupied till death should come. Darkness seemed to cover everything, but by reason of this darkness he felt that the only guiding thread through its labyrinth was to occupy himself with his labors of reform, and he clung to them with all the force of his character. End of chapter 31 and end of part 3 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. Part 4, Chapter 1. Karenin and his wife continued to live in the same house and to meet every day, and yet they remained entire strangers to each other. Alexey Alexandrovitch made a point every day to be seen with his wife, so that the servants might not have the right to gossip, but he avoided dining at home. Vronsky was never seen there. Anna met him outside, and her husband knew it. All three suffered from a situation which would have been intolerable for a single day, had not each believed it to be transitory. Alexey Alexandrovitch expected to see this passion, like everything else in the world, come to an end, and thus his name would not be dishonored. Anna, the cause of all the trouble, and the one on whom the consequences weighed the most cruelly, accepted her position simply and solely because she expected, nay, was firmly convinced, that the matter would soon be explained and settled. She had not the least idea how it would come about, but she was certain that it would now come about very speedily. Vronsky, in spite of himself, submitting to her views, was also awaiting something to happen independent of himself, which should resolve all their difficulty. Toward the middle of the winter Vronsky had to spend a very tiresome week. He was delegated to show a foreign prince about Petersburg. Vronsky himself was a representative Russian. Not only was he irreproachable in his bearing, but he was accustomed to the society of such exalted personages. Therefore he was given the charge of the prince. But this responsibility was very distasteful to him. The prince did not want to let anything pass concerning which he might be asked on his return, "Did you see that in Russia?" And moreover, he wanted to enjoy as far as possible all the pleasures peculiar to the country. Vronsky was obliged to be his guide in the one and in the other. In the morning they went out to see the sights. In the evening they took part in the national amusements. The prince enjoyed exceptionally good health, even for a prince, and, owing to his gymnastic exercises and the scrupulous care he took of himself, notwithstanding the excesses to which he let his love for pleasure carry him, he remained as fresh as a great, green, shiny Dutch cucumber. He had been a great traveler, and had found that one of the great advantages of easy modern communication consisted in the fact that it brought national amusements into easy reach. In Spain he had given serenades, and fallen in love with a Spanish girl who played the mandolin. In Switzerland he had killed a chamois. In England leaped ditches in a red shooting jacket, and shot 200 pheasants on a wager. In Turkey he had penetrated a harem. In India he had ridden the elephant, and now he wanted to taste the special pleasures that Russia afforded. Vronsky, as master of ceremonies, arranged, with no little difficulty, a program of amusement truly Russian in character. There were races, and blini, or carnival cakes, and bear hunts, and troika parties and gypsies, and feasts set forth with Russian dishes, and the prince with extraordinary appetite entered into the spirit of these Russian sports, broke his waiter of glasses with the rest, took a gypsy girl on his knee, and apparently asked himself if the whole Russian spirit consisted only in this, without going further. In reality, the prince took more delight in French actresses, ballet dancers, and white seal champagne than in all the other pleasures which the Russians could offer him. Vronsky was accustomed to princes, but either because he had changed of late, or else because he had too close a view of this particular prince, the week seemed terribly burdensome to him. During the whole week, without cessation, he experienced a feeling like that of a man placed in charge of a dangerous lunatic, who dreaded his patient, and, at the same time, from very force of proximity, feared for his own reason. Vronsky was constantly under the necessity of keeping up the strictest barriers of official reserve in order not to feel insulted. The prince's behavior toward the very persons who, to Vronsky's amazement, were ready to crawl out of their skin to give him experiences of Russian amusements, was scornful. His criticism on the Russian women whom he wanted to study more than once made Vronsky go red with indignation. What irritated Vronsky most violently about this prince was that he could not help seeing himself in him, and what he saw in this mirror was not flattering to his vanity. What he saw there was a very stupid, a very self-confident, and very healthy, and very fastidious man, and that was all. He was a gentleman, and Vronsky could not deny the fact. He was smooth and frank with his superiors, free and easy with his equals, coolly kind toward his inferiors. Vronsky himself was exactly the same, and was proud of it, but in his relations to the prince he was the inferior, and this scornfully good-natured treatment of himself nettled him. "Stupid ox! Is it possible I am like him?" he thought. However this may have been, at the end of the week, when he took leave of the prince, who was on his way to Moscow, he was delighted to be delivered from this inconvenient situation and this disagreeable mirror. They went directly to the station from a bear hunt, which had occupied all the night with brilliant exhibitions of Russian daring. End of chapter 1. On his return home, Vronsky found a note from Anna. She wrote, "I am ill and unhappy. I cannot go out, and I cannot live longer without seeing you. Come this evening. Alexey Alexandrovitch will be at the council from 7 o'clock till 10. This invitation, given in spite of her husband's formal prohibition, seemed strange to him, but he finally decided to go to Anna's. Since the beginning of the winter, Vronsky had been promoted as colonel. He had left the regiment and was living alone. After having finished his breakfast, he stretched himself out on the divan, and in 5 minutes the recollection of the wild scenes of the preceding days became curiously mingled in his mind with Anna and a peasant whipper-in, who had performed an important part in the bear hunt, and finally he fell asleep. He awoke. Night had come. Shivering with apprehension, he hastily lighted the candle. "What has happened to me? What terrible dream have I had?" he asked himself. Yes, the peasant, a dirty little man with a dishevelled beard, bent something or other up double and pronounced some strange words in French. I didn't dream anything else. Why am I so terrified? But in recalling the peasant and his incomprehensible French words, a sense of something horrible sent a cold shiver down his back. What nonsense, he thought, as he looked at his watch. It was already 8:30. He called his man, dressed quickly, went out, and entirely forgetting his dream, thought only of being late. As he approached the Karenins' house, he again looked at his watch and saw that it lacked 10 minutes of 9. A high, narrow carriage, drawn by 2 grey horses, stood in front of the door. He recognized Anna's carriage. She was coming to my house, he said to himself. And it would be better. It is disagreeable for me to go into this house, but it makes no difference to me. I cannot conceal myself. And, with the manner of a man accustomed from childhood to act above board, he left his sleigh and mounted the steps. The door opened, and the Swiss, carrying a plaid, motioned to the carriage to draw near. Vronsky, who was not accustomed to observe details, was struck by the look of astonishment which the Swiss gave him. At the door, Vronsky came near running into Alexey Alexandrovitch. A gas-light placed at the entrance of the vestibule threw full light on his pale, worn face. He wore a black hat and a white cravat showing under a fur collar. Karenin's gloomy, dull eyes fixed themselves on Vronsky, who bowed. Alexey Alexandrovitch, drawing his lips together, raised his hand to his hat and passed. Vronsky saw him get into his carriage without turning round, take his plaid and opera-glass, which the Swiss servant handed through the door, and disappear. Vronsky went into the anteroom. His brows were contracted, and his eyes flashed with anger and outraged pride. What a situation, thought Vronsky. If he would fight to defend his honor, I should know what to do to express my sentiments. But this weakness, or cowardice, he places me in the position of a deceiver, which I never was and never will be. Since the explanation that he had had with Anna in the Verda garden, Vronsky's idea had greatly changed. Involuntarily overcome by Anna's weakness, for she had given herself to him without reserve and expected from him only the decision as to her future fate, Vronsky had long ceased to think that this liaison might end up as he supposed it would. His ambitious plans had again been relegated to the background, and he, feeling that he had definitely left that circle of activity where everything was determined, gave himself up entirely to his feeling, and this feeling drew him more and more vigorously towards her. Even in the reception-room, he heard her footsteps drawing near. He knew that she was waiting for him and had just entered the drawing-room near by to watch for him. "No," she cried, seeing him enter. "Things cannot go on this way." And at the sound of her own voice her eyes filled with tears. "If this is going on this way, it would be far better if it had ended long ago." "What is the matter, my friend?" "The matter? I have been waiting in torture for 2 hours. But no, I do not want to quarrel with you. Of course you could not come. No, I will not scold you any more." She put her 2 hands on his shoulders and looked at him long, with her eyes deep and tender, although searching. She studied his face for all the time that she had not seen him. As always happened every time they met, she tried to compare her imaginary presentment of him. It was incomparably better because it was impossible in reality, with him as he really was. End of chapter 2. "Did you meet him?" she asked when they were seated under the lamp by the drawing-room table. "That is your punishment for coming so late." "Yes. How did it happen? Should he not have been at the council?" "He went there, but he came back again, and now he has gone off somewhere again. But that is no matter. Let us talk no more about it. But where have you been? All this time with the prince?" She knew the most minute details of his life. He wanted to reply that as he had no rest the night before, he allowed himself to oversleep, but the sight of her happy, excited face made this acknowledgment difficult, and he excused himself on the plea of having been obliged to go and present his report about the prince's departure. "It is over now, is it? Has he gone?" "Yes, thank the Lord, it is all done with. You have no idea how intolerable this week has seemed to me." "Why so? Here you have not been leading the life customary to young men," she said, frowning, and, without looking at Vronsky, she took up some crocheting that was lying on the table and pulled out the needle. "I renounced that life long ago," he replied, wondering at the sudden change in her beautiful face, and trying to discover what it portended. "I assure you," he added smiling, and showing his white teeth, "that it was overpoweringly unpleasant to me to look at that old life again, as it were, in a mirror." She kept her crocheting in her hand, although she did not work, but looked at him with strange, brilliant, not quite friendly eyes. "Liza came to see me this morning. They are not yet afraid to come to my house, in spite of the Countess Lidia Ivanovna," and here she stood up, "and told me about your Athenian nights. What an abomination!" "I only wanted to tell you that—" She interrupted him. "That it was Teresa, whom you used to know?" "I was going to say, how odious you men are! How can you suppose that a woman forgets?" And she, growing more and more animated, and then disclosing the cause of her irritation. "And above all a woman who can know nothing of your life. What can I know except what you wish to tell me? And how can I know whether it is the truth? Anna, you insult me. Have you no longer any faith in me? Have I not told you that I have no thoughts which I would conceal from you?" Yes, yes, she said, trying to drive away her jealous fears. But if you only knew how I suffer! I believe in you. I do believe in you. But what did you want to say to me?" He could not instantly remember what he wanted to say. Anna's fits of jealousy were becoming more and more frequent, and, however much he tried to conceal it, these scenes made him grow cool toward her, although he knew that the cause of the jealousy was her very love for him. How many times had he not said to himself that happiness existed for him only in this love? And now that she loved him as only a woman can love for whom love outweighs all other treasures in life, happiness seemed farther off than when he had followed her from Moscow. Then he considered himself unhappy, but happiness was in sight. Now he felt that their highest happiness was in the past. She was entirely different from what she had been when he first saw her. Both morally and physically she had changed for the worse. The beauty of her form was gone, and when she spoke about the French actress, a wicked expression came over her face which spoiled it. He looked at her as a man looks at a flower which he has plucked and which has faded, and he finds it hard to recognize the beauty for the sake of which he had plucked it and despoiled it. And yet he felt that at the time when his passion was more violent, he might, if he had earnestly desired it, have torn his love out of his heart. But now, at the very time when it seemed to him that he felt no love for her, he knew that the tie that bound him to her was indissoluble. "Well, well, tell me what you have to say about the prince," replied Anna. "I have driven away the demon. I have driven him away," she added. Between themselves they called their jealousy the demon. "You began to tell me something about the prince. Why was it so disagreeable to you?" "Oh, it was unbearable," replied Vronsky, trying to pick up the thread of his thought again. "The prince doesn't improve on close acquaintance. I can only compare him to one of those highly fed animals which take first prizes at exhibitions," he added, with an air of vexation which seemed to interest Anna. "No, but how? Is he not a cultivated man, who has seen much of the world?" "It is an entirely different kind of cultivation, their cultivation. One would say that he was cultivated only for the sake of scorning cultivation, as he scorns everything else, except animal pleasures." "But are you not also fond of all these animal pleasures yourself?" said Anna, and once more he noticed the gloomy look in her eyes which avoided his. "Why do you defend him?" he asked, smiling. "I am not defending him. It is all absolutely indifferent to me. But it seems to me, if you do not like these pleasures, you might dispense with them. But you enjoy going to see that Teresa in the costume of Eve." "There is the demon again," said Vronsky, taking her hand which lay on the table and kissing it. "Yes, but I can't help it. You can't imagine what I suffered while I was waiting for you. I do not think I am jealous. I am not jealous. When you are here with me, I believe in you. But when you are away, leading a life so incomprehensible to me—" She drew away from him, drew the crochet needle out of her work, and, speedily, with the help of her index finger, the stitches of white wool gleaming in the lamplight began one after another to take form, and swiftly, nervously, the delicate wrist moved back and forth in the embroidered cuff. "Tell me, how was it? Where did you meet Alexey Alexandrovitch?" she asked suddenly, in a voice still sounding unnatural. "We ran against each other at the door." "And did he greet you like this?" She drew down her face and, half closing her eyes, instantly changed her whole expression, and Vronsky suddenly saw the same look in her pretty features which Alexey Alexandrovitch had worn when he bowed to him. He smiled, and Anna began to laugh, with that fresh, ringing laugh which was one of her greatest charms. "I really do not understand him," said Vronsky. "I should have supposed that after your explanation at the dacha he would have broken off with you and provoked a duel with me. But how can he endure such a situation? He suffers, that is evident." "He?" she said with a sneer. "Oh, he is perfectly content." "Why should we all torture ourselves in this way, when everything might be so easily arranged?" "Only that doesn't suit him. Oh, don't I know him, and the falsity on which he subsists? How could he live as he lives with me if he had any feelings? He has no susceptibilities, no feelings. Could a man of any susceptibilities live in the same house with his guilty wife? How can he talk to her? How can he address her familiarly? And again she imitated the way her husband would say, "Tui, ma chère, tui, Anna." "He is not a man, I tell you. He is a puppet. No one knows it, but I know it. Oh, if I had been in his place, I would long ago have killed, have torn to pieces, a wife like myself, instead of saying, 'Tui, ma chère Anna,' to her. But he is not a man. He is a ministerial machine. He does not understand that I am your wife, that he is nothing to me, that he is in the way. No, no, let us not talk about him." "You are unjust, my dear," said Vronsky, trying to calm her. "But all the same, let us not talk any more about him. Tell me how you do. How are you? You wrote me you were ill. What did the doctor say?" She looked at him with gay raillery. Evidently she saw ridiculous and abominable traits in her husband, and would willingly have continued to speak about them. But he added, "I suspect that you are not really ill, but that it comes from your condition. When will it be?" The sarcastic gleam disappeared from Anna's eyes, but suddenly a different kind of smile, a token of a gentle melancholy, of some feeling he could not comprehend, took its place. "Soon, very soon. You said our position is painful, and that it must be changed. If you knew how hard it is for me, what I would give to be able to love you freely and openly, I should not torment myself, and I should not torment you with my jealousy. And this will be soon, but not in the way we think." And at the thought of how this would take place, she felt such pity for herself that the tears filled her eyes and she could not go on. She put her white hand, with the rings sparkling in the lamplight, on Vronsky's arm. "This will not be as we think. I did not intend to speak to you about this, but you compel me to. Soon, very soon, every knot will be disentangled, and all of us, all, will be at peace, and we shall not be tormented any more." "I do not know what you mean," he said, yet he understood her. "You ask, when will it be? Soon, and I shall not survive it. Don't interrupt me," and she went on speaking rapidly. "I know it. I am perfectly certain I am going to die. And I am glad to die, and to free myself, and you." Her tears continued to fall. Vronsky bent over her hand and began to kiss it, and tried to conceal his own emotion, which he knew he had no ground for feeling, but which he could not overcome. "It is better that it should be so," she said, pressing his hand fervently. "It is the only thing left for us." "What a foolish idea," said Vronsky, lifting up his head and regaining his self-possession. "What utter nonsense you are talking." "No, it is the truth." "What do you mean by the truth?" "That I am going to die. I have seen it in a dream." "In a dream," repeated Vronsky, involuntarily recalling the music of his nightmare. "Yes, in a dream," she continued. "I had this dream a long time ago. I dreamed that I ran into my room to get something or other. I was searching about, you know, as one does in dreams," she said, opening her eyes wide with horror. "And I noticed something standing in the corner of my room." "What nonsense! How do you suppose—" But she would not let him interrupt her. What she was telling was too important to her. "And this something turned around, and I saw a little dirty music with an unkempt beard. I wanted to run away, but he bent toward a bag, in which he moved some object. She made the motion of a person rummaging in a bag. Terror was depicted on her face, and Vronsky, recalling his own dream, felt the same terror seize his soul. And all the while he was searching, he talked fast, very fast, in French, lisping, you know. Il faut le battre, le faire, le broyer, le petre. I tried to wake up, but I only woke up in my dream, asking what it could mean. And Karenina said to me, 'You are going to die. You are going to die in childbed, Matushka.' And at last I woke up." "What an absurd dream," said Vronsky, but he himself felt that there was no conviction in his voice. "But let us say no more about it. Ring, I am going to give you some tea, so stay a little longer. It is a long time since I—" She suddenly ceased speaking. The expression of her face instantly changed. Horror and emotion disappeared from her face, which assumed an expression of gentle, serious, and affectionate solicitude. He could not understand the significance of that change. She had felt within her the motion of a new life. End of chapter 3. After meeting Vronsky on the porch, Alexey Alexandrovitch went, as he had planned, to the Italian opera. He sat through 2 acts and saw everyone whom he needed to see. Returning home, he looked carefully at the hat rack, and, having assured himself that there was no uniform overcoat in the vestibule, went straight to his chamber. Contrary to his usual habit, instead of going to bed, he walked up and down his room till 3 o'clock in the morning. Anger kept him awake, for he could not forgive his wife for not being willing to observe the proprieties, and for not fulfilling the one condition that he had imposed on her, that she should not receive her lover in his house. She had not complied with his requirement, and he felt bound to punish her, carry out his threat, demand a divorce, and take away his son from her. He knew all the difficulties that would attend this action, but he had said that he should do it, and now he was bound to carry out his threat. The Countess Lydia had often said that this was the easiest way out of his position, and recently the practice of divorce had reached such a pitch of perfection that Alexey Alexandrovitch saw in it a means of escaping its formal difficulties. Moreover, misfortunes never come single, and the trouble arising from the organization of the foreign population and the irrigation of the fields in the government of Zarai had caused Alexey Alexandrovitch so much unpleasantness in his office that for some time he had been in a perpetual state of irritation. He passed the night without sleeping, and his anger increasing all the while in a sort of colossal system of progression, by morning was directed even to the most trivial object. He dressed hastily, and went to Anna as soon as he knew she was up. He was afraid of losing the energy which he needed for his explanation with his wife. It was as if he carried a full cup of wrath and was afraid of spilling it. Anna believed that she thoroughly knew her husband, but she was amazed at his appearance as he came in. His brows were contracted, and his eyes looked gloomily straight ahead, avoiding hers. His lips were firm and scornfully compressed. Never had his wife seen so much decision as she saw now in his gait, in every motion, in the sound of his voice. He entered without wishing her good morning, and went directly to her writing desk, and, taking the key, opened the drawer. "What do you want?" cried Anna. "Your lover's letters." "They are not there," she said, closing the drawer, but he knew by her action that he had guessed aright, and, roughly pushing away her hand, he quickly seized the portfolio in which he knew Anna kept her important papers. She attempted to regain it, but he held it at a distance. "Sit down. I want to speak to you," he said, placing the portfolio under his arm, and holding it so firmly with his elbow that his shoulder was raised by it. Anna looked at him, astonished and frightened, but said nothing. "I told you that I would not permit you to receive your lover in this house." "I needed to see him to—" She stopped, unable to find a plausible explanation. "I will not enter into details, and have no desire to know why a woman needs to see her lover." "I only," she said, flashing up and feeling that her husband's rudeness made her bold. "Is it possible that you are not aware how easy it is for you to insult me?" "One can insult only an honest man or an honest woman. But to tell a thief that he is a thief is only la constatation de la faute, the statement of a fact." "That is a degree of cruelty that I never recognized in you." "Ah, you find a husband cruel because he gives his wife perfect freedom, gives her the protection of an honest, noble name, on the sole condition that she respect the laws of propriety. You call that cruelty?" "It is worse than cruelty. It is cowardice, if you insist on knowing," cried Anna, with an outburst of anger, and, rising, she started to go. "No!" cried he in his piping voice, which was now a tone higher than usual, and seizing her by the arm with his great bony fingers so roughly that one of Anna's bracelets left a red print on her flesh, he forced her back into her place. "Cowardice indeed! If you wish to employ that word, apply it to her who abandons her son and husband for a lover, and nevertheless eats her husband's bread." Anna bowed her head. She not only did not say what she had said the evening before to her lover, that he was her husband while her husband was in the way. She did not even think it. She appreciated all the justice of his words, and she replied in a low voice, "You cannot judge my position more severely than I do myself. But why do you say all this?" "Why do I say this?" continued he as angrily as ever, "so that you may know that since you have paid no attention to my wishes, and have broken the rules of propriety, I shall take measures to put an end to this state of affairs." "Soon, very soon, it will terminate itself," said Anna, and again at the thought of that death which she felt near at hand, and now so desirable, her eyes filled with tears. "Sooner even than you and your lover have dreamed of. You need to make atonement by keen suffering." "Alexey Alexandrovitch, I do not say that this is not magnanimous, but it is not gentlemanly to strike one who is down." "You only think of yourself. The suffering of one who has been your husband is of little interest to you. It is a matter of indifference to you that his life has been overthrown, that he suffers." Alexey Alexandrovitch spoke so rapidly that he stammered and could not speak the word. This seemed ridiculous to Anna, but she immediately was ashamed of herself because anything could seem to her ridiculous at such a moment. For the first time, and for a moment, she felt for him and entered into his feelings and pitied him. But what could she say or do? She bowed her head and was silent. He also was silent for a little, then began again in a less piercing and colder voice, emphasizing the words of no special importance. "I came to tell you," she glanced at him. "No, that proves it to me," she said to herself as she remembered the expression of his face as he stammered over the word suffered. "No, how can a man, with his dull eyes, so full of calm self-satisfaction, feel anything?" "I cannot change," she murmured. "I have come to tell you that tomorrow I am going to Moscow, and that I shall not enter this house again. You will learn of my determination from the lawyer who will have charge of the preliminaries of the divorce. My son will go to my sister," he added, recalling with difficulty what he wanted to say about the child. "You want to take Seroza away so as to cause me pain," she cried, glaring at him. "You do not love him. Leave Seroza." "Yes, I have lost even my love for my son because the repulsion you inspire in me includes him, but I shall keep him, nevertheless. Good morning." He was about to go, but she detained him. "Alexey Alexandrovitch, leave Seroza with me," she whispered again. "That is all I ask of you. Leave him with me till I shall soon be confined. Leave him with me." Alexey Alexandrovitch flushed with indignation, pushed away the arm that held him back, and left her without replying. End of chapter 4. The reception room of the celebrated Petersburg lawyer was full of people when Alexey Alexandrovitch entered it. 3 ladies, one old, another young, and a merchant's wife. 3 men, a German banker with a ring on his hand, a merchant with a beard, and a sullen-looking official in undress uniform, with a decoration around his neck, had apparently been waiting a long time. 2 clerks were writing with scratching pens. Their writing utensils, and Alexey Alexandrovitch was a connoisseur of such things, were of unusual excellence. Alexey could not fail to take note of that fact. One of the clerks turned his head with an air of annoyance toward the newcomer, and, without rising, asked him with half-closed eyes, "What do you want?" "I have business with the lawyer." "He is busy," replied the clerk, severely, pointing with his pen toward those who were already waiting, and he went back to his writing. "Will he not find a moment to receive me?" asked Alexey Alexandrovitch. "He is not at liberty a single moment. He is always busy. Have the goodness to wait." "Be so good as to give him my card," said Alexey Alexandrovitch with dignity, seeing that it was impossible to preserve his incognito. The secretary took his card and, evidently not approving of it, left the room. Alexey Alexandrovitch, on principle, approved of public courts, but he did not fully sympathize with certain details of its application in Russia because of his acquaintance with its working in the best official relations, and he criticized them as far as he could criticize anything that received the sanction of the supreme power. His whole life was spent in administrative activity, and consequently, when he did not sympathize with anything, his lack of sympathy was modified by his recognition of the fact that errors were unavoidable, but that some things might be remedied. In the new judicial arrangement he did not approve of the conditions in which the lawyers were placed. Hitherto he had not had occasion to deal with lawyers, and so he had disapproved of the system only theoretically. But now his disapprobation was greatly increased by the disagreeable impression made on him in the lawyer's reception-room. "The lawyer will be out immediately," said the clerk, and in reality in about 2 minutes the door opened, and the lawyer appeared, together with a tall justice of the peace. The lawyer was a short, thick-set man, with a bald head, a dark reddish beard, a prominent forehead, and long, shiny eyebrows. His dress, from his necktie and double watch-chain down to his polished boots, was that of a dandy. His face was intelligent but vulgar, his manner pretentious and in bad taste. "Be so good as to walk in," said he, addressing Alexey Alexandrovitch, and gloomily ushering him into the next room, he closed the door. "Will you not sit?" He pointed to an arm-chair near his desk covered with papers, and rubbing his short, hairy hands together, he settled himself in front of the desk and bent his head to one side. But he was hardly seated when a moth-miller flew on the table, and the little man, with unexpected liveliness, caught it on the wing. Then he quickly resumed his former attitude. "Before beginning to explain my business," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, following the movements of the lawyer with astonishment, "I must inform you that the subject which brings me here is to be kept secret." An imperceptible smile slightly moved the lawyer's projecting reddish moustache. "If I were not capable of keeping the secrets entrusted to me, I should not be a lawyer," said he. "But if you wish to be assured—" Alexey Alexandrovitch glanced at him and noticed that his grey eyes, full of intelligence, had apparently read all that he had to tell. "Do you know my name?" asked Alexey Alexandrovitch. "I know you, and how valuable," here again he caught a miller, "your services are, as every Russian does," replied the lawyer, bowing. Alexey Alexandrovitch sighed. With difficulty he brought himself to speak, but when he had once begun he continued unhesitatingly in a clear, sharp voice, emphasizing certain words. "I have the misfortune to be a deceived husband. I wish to obtain legal separation from my wife, that is, a divorce, and, above all, to separate my son from his mother." The lawyer's grey eyes did their best to remain serious, but they danced with unrestrained delight, and Alexey Alexandrovitch saw that they were full of an amusement not caused solely by the prospect of a good suit. They shone with enthusiasm, with triumph, something like the brilliancy he had noticed in his wife's eyes. "You wish my assistance to obtain the divorce?" "Yes, exactly. But I must warn you that I run the risk of wasting your time. I have come only to ask preliminary advice. I wish a divorce, but for me certain forms are essential in which it is possible. Very possibly I shall give up the idea of any legal attempt if these forms do not coincide with my requirements." "Oh, that is always the way," said the lawyer. "You will always remain perfectly free." The little man, that he might not offend his client by the delight which his face ill concealed, fixed his eyes on Alexey Alexandrovitch's feet. He saw a moth flying in front of his nose, and he put out his hand, but he restrained himself, out of respect to Alexey Alexandrovitch's situation. "The general features of the laws of divorce are well known to me," continued Alexey Alexandrovitch, "but I should like to have a general knowledge of the formalities which are employed in the practical settlement of affairs of this kind." "You wish," replied the lawyer, not raising his eyes and entering with no little satisfaction into the spirit of his client's words, "you wish me to expound for you the way whereby your wishes may be fulfilled." And, as Alexey Alexandrovitch assented with an inclination of his head, he continued, casting a furtive glance now and then at his face, which was flushed with red spots. "Divorce, according to our laws," said he, with a slight shade of disdain for our laws, "is possible, as you know, in the following cases." "Let them wait!" he cried, seeing his clerk open the door. However, he rose, went to say a few words to him, came back, and sat down again. In the following cases: a physical defect of one of the parties. Next, the unexplained absence of one of them for 5 years. In making this enumeration he bent his short hairy fingers one after another. And finally, adultery. This word he pronounced with evident satisfaction. The categories are as follows. He kept on doubling over his fat fingers, although the case before him and the categories, it was plain enough, could not be classified together. Physical incapacity of husband or wife. Then adultery of husband or wife. Then, as all his fingers were closed, he raised them all again and proceeded. This is the theoretical view, but I think that, in doing me the honour to consult me, you desire to know the practical side, do you not? And therefore, guiding myself by antecedents, it is my duty to inform you that as this case is neither one of physical defect nor absence of one of the parties, as I understand? Alexey Alexandrovitch bowed his head in confirmation of this. The reason last named remains, adultery, and the conviction of the guilty party by mutual consent, and without mutual consent, compulsory conviction. I must say that the last case is rarely met with in practice, said the lawyer, and he glanced at his client and waited, like a gunsmith who explains to a purchaser the use of 2 pistols of different calibre, leaving him free to choose between them. But Alexey Alexandrovitch remaining silent, he continued. The commonest, simplest, and most reasonable way, in my opinion, is to recognize the guilt by mutual agreement. I should not allow myself to say this if I were talking to a man of less experience than yourself, said the lawyer, but I suppose that this is comprehensible to you. Alexey Alexandrovitch, however, was so troubled that he did not at the first moment realize the reasonableness of adultery by mutual agreement, and this uncertainty was to be read in his eyes, but the lawyer came at once to his aid. Suppose that a man and wife can no longer live together. If both consent to a divorce, the details and formalities amount to nothing. This is the simplest and surest way. Alexey Alexandrovitch understood now, but he had religious convictions which stood in the way of his employing this measure. In the present case, this means is out of the question, said he. Here only one case is possible, compulsory conviction, supported by letters which are in my possession. At the mention of letters, the lawyer, pressing his lips together, uttered an exclamation both of pity and disdain. Please take notice, he began. Affairs of this sort are, as you well know, decided by the upper clergy, he said. Our fathers the protopopes are great connoisseurs in affairs of this kind, and attend to the minutest details, said he, with a smile which showed his sympathy for the protopopes. Letters undoubtedly might serve as partial evidence, but proofs must be furnished in the right way, by witnesses. However, if you do me the honour to grant me your confidence, you must give me the choice of measures to be pursued. Where there is a will, there is a way. If that is so, began Alexey Alexandrovitch, suddenly growing very pale. But at that instant the lawyer again ran to the door to reply to a fresh interruption from the clerk. Tell her then that this is not a cheap shop, said he, and returned to Alexey Alexandrovitch. As he returned to his place, he caught another moth. My reps will be in a fine condition by summer, he said to himself, scowling. You were kind enough to say. I will communicate to you my decision by letter, replied Alexey Alexandrovitch, standing up and leaning his hand on the table. After standing for a moment in thought, he said, From your words I conclude that a divorce is possible. I shall be obliged to you if you will make your conditions known to me. Everything is possible if you will give me entire freedom of action, said the lawyer, eluding the last question. When may I expect a communication from you? Asked he, moving to the door with eyes as shiny as his boots. Within a week. You will then have the goodness to let me know whether you accept the case, and on what terms? Very good. The lawyer bowed respectfully, conducted his client to the door, and when he was left alone, he gave vent to his feelings of joy. He felt so gay that, contrary to his principles, he made a deduction to a lady skilled in the art of making a bargain, and neglected to catch a moth, resolving definitely that he would have his furniture upholstered the next winter with velvet, as Sagonin had. Chapter 6. Alexey Alexandrovitch had won a brilliant victory at the session of the Commission of August 29, but the consequences of his victory were injurious to him. The new committee appointed to study the situation of the foreign population had been constituted, and had gone to its field of action with a promptness and energy surprising to Alexey Alexandrovitch. At the end of 3 months it presented its report. The condition of this population had been studied from a political, administrative, economical, ethnographical, material, and religious point of view. Each question was followed by an admirably concise reply, leaving no room to doubt that these answers were the work, not of a human mind, always liable to mistake, but of an experienced bureaucracy. These answers were based on official data, such as the reports of governors and archbishops, based again on the reports of heads of districts and ecclesiastical superintendents, in their turn based on the reports from communal administrations and country priests, and therefore their correctness could not be doubted. Questions such as these, why are the harvests poor, and why do the inhabitants of certain localities persist in their beliefs, and the like, questions which without the help of the official machine could never be solved, and to which ages would not have found a reply, were clearly solved in conformity with the opinions of Alexey Alexandrovitch. But Stremov, feeling that he had been touched to the quick at the last session, had employed for the reception of the committee's report a stratagem unexpected by Alexey Alexandrovitch. Taking with him several other members, he suddenly went over to Karenin's side, and, not satisfied with warmly supporting the measures proposed by Alexey Alexandrovitch, he proposed others of the same nature. These measures, which were of such a radical nature as to be entirely opposed to Alexey Alexandrovitch's intention, were adopted, and then Stremov's tactics were revealed. Carried to extremes, these measures seemed so ridiculous that the government officials, and public opinion, and ladies of influence, and the daily papers, all attacked them and expressed the greatest indignation both at the measures themselves and at their avowed promoter, Alexey Alexandrovitch. Stremov slipped out of sight, pretending that he only blindly followed Karenin's plan, and that he himself was amazed and dumbfounded at what had happened. This greatly weakened Alexey Alexandrovitch, but notwithstanding his enfeebled health, notwithstanding his family annoyances, he did not give up. The committee was split into 2 factions. Some of them, with Stremov at their head, explained their mistake by the fact that they had placed full confidence in the revisionary committee which, under the lead of Alexey Alexandrovitch, had brought in its report, and they declared the report of this committee of inspection was rubbish and so much wasted paper. Alexey Alexandrovitch, with a party of men who saw the peril of such a revolutionary reference to documents, continued to support the data worked out by the revisionary committee. As a result of this, the highest circles, and even society, was thrown into confusion, and always this was a question of the greatest interest to everyone. No one could make out whether the foreign populations were in reality suffering and dying out, or flourishing. Karenin's position in consequence of this, and partly in consequence of the contempt which people felt for him by reason of his wife's unfaithfulness, became very precarious. In this state of affairs he made an important resolution. To the great astonishment of the commission, he announced that he demanded the right to go and study these questions himself on the spot, and, permission having been granted him, Alexey Alexandrovitch set out for the distant provinces. His departure made a great sensation, especially from the fact that, at his very departure, he officially refused the travelling expenses required for 12 post-horses to take him to the places of inspection. "I think that was very noble of him," said Betsy to the Princess Myakaya. "Why should they pay for post-horses, when everyone knows that you can go everywhere nowadays by rail?" But the Princess Myakaya did not agree with her, and she was greatly wrought up by the Princess Tverskaya's remark. "This is very well for you to say," she replied, "when you have I don't know how many millions. but I like it very much when my husband goes off on a tour of inspection in the summer. It is very healthy and agreeable for him to go driving about, but I have made it a rule to keep that money for my own horse hire and izvozchiks." On his way to the distant provinces, Alexey Alexandrovitch stopped at Moscow 3 days. The next day after his arrival, he was coming from a call on the Governor-General. At the crossing of the Gazetnoye Street, where carriages of every description are always thronging, he heard his name called in such a gay, sonorous voice that he could not help stopping. There stood Stepan Arkadyevitch on the sidewalk, in a short, stylish paletot, with a stylish hat set on one side, with a radiant smile which showed his white teeth between his red lips, gay, youthful-looking, brilliant. He kept calling to him and beckoning to him to stop. He was holding by one hand to the window of a carriage which had drawn up to the sidewalk, and in the carriage was a woman in a velvet hat, with 2 little ones. She also beckoned to him and smiled. It was Dolly and her children. Alexey Alexandrovitch had not counted on seeing in Moscow anyone whom he knew, and least of all his wife's brother. He took off his hat and would have proceeded, but Stepan Arkadyevitch motioned to the coachman to stop, and ran through the snow to the carriage. "How long have you been here? What a sin not to let us know you were coming! I was at Dussault's last evening, and saw the name of Karenina on the list of arrivals, but it never occurred to me that it was you, else I should have looked you up," said he, passing his head through the door. "How glad I am to see you," he went on to say, striking his feet together to shake off the snow. "What a sin not to let us know!" "I hadn't time. I am very busy," replied Alexey Alexandrovitch curtly. "Come and speak to my wife. She wants to see you very much." Alexey Alexandrovitch threw off the plaid which covered his chilly limbs, and, leaving his carriage, made away through the snow to Darya Alexandrovna. "Why, what has happened, Alexey Alexandrovitch, that you avoid us in this way?" said she, smiling. "I was very busy. I am delighted to see you," replied Karenin, in a tone which clearly proved that he was annoyed. "How is your health?" "How is my dear Anna?" Alexey Alexandrovitch muttered a few words, and was about to leave her, but Stepan Arkadyevitch detained him. "Do you know what we are going to do tomorrow? Dolly, invite him to dinner. Have Kvasnoyshev and Pestov, so as to regale him with the representative intellects of Moscow." "Oh, please come," said Dolly. "We will name any hour that is convenient, 5 or 6, as you please. But how is my dear Anna? It is so long." "She is well," muttered Alexey Alexandrovitch, again frowning. "Very happy to have met you." And he went back to his carriage. "Will you come?" cried Dolly again. Alexey Alexandrovitch said something in reply which Dolly could not hear in the rumble of carriages. "I am coming to see you tomorrow," cried Stepan Arkadyevitch. Alexey Alexandrovitch shut himself up in his carriage, and crouched down in one corner so as not to see and not to be seen. "What a strange fellow!" said Stepan Arkadyevitch to his wife, and looking at his watch he made an affectionate sign of farewell to his wife and children, and started off down the sidewalk at a brisk pace. "Stiva! Stiva!" cried Dolly, blushing. He came back. "I must have some money for the children's cloaks. Give me some." "No matter about that. Tell them that I will settle the bill." And he disappeared, gaily nodding to some acquaintance as he went. End of chapter 6. The next day was Sunday, and Stepan Arkadyevitch went to the Bolshoi, or Great Theatre, to attend the rehearsal of the ballet, and give the coral necklace to Masha Tchipisobaya, the pretty dancing girl who was making her début under his protection, and as he had promised the day before, and behind the scenes in the dim twilight of the theatre, he seized his opportunity and kissed her pretty little face glowing with pleasure at his gift. Besides fulfilling his promise as to the coral necklace, he wanted to arrange with her for an assignation after the ballet. Having explained to her that he could not possibly manage to be present at the beginning of the ballet, he promised to come for the next act and take her out for supper. From the theatre, Stepan Arkadyevitch went to the Okhotnoye Ryad, himself selected a fish and asparagus for the dinner, and at noon he went to Dussault's, where 3 travellers, friends of his, by happy chance were stopping. Levin, just returned from his journey abroad, his new nachalnik, or chief, who had just been appointed and had come to Moscow to look into affairs, and lastly, his brother-in-law, Karenin, whom he was bound to invite to dinner. Stepan Arkadyevitch liked to go out to dinner, but what he liked better still was to give a choice little dinner party with a few select friends. The programme that he made out for this day pleased him: fresh perch, with asparagus, and a simple but superb roast of beef, as pièce de résistance, and the right kinds of wine. Among the guests he expected Kitty and Levin, and, to offset them, a cousin and the young Shtcherbatsky. The pièce de résistance among the guests were to be Sergei Koznoi-Shev, a Muscovite and philosopher, and Karenin, a Petersburger and a man of affairs. Moreover, he would invite the well-known Pestov, a comical fellow, a youth of 50 years, an enthusiast, a musician, a ready talker, a historian and a liberal, who would be the sauce or garnish for Koznoi-Shev and Alexey Alexandrovitch. He would put everyone in good spirits and stir them up. The second instalment of money from the sale of the wood had been recently received, and was not all gone. Dolly for some time had been lovely and charming, and the thought of this dinner in every respect delighted Stepan Arkadyevitch. He was in the happiest frame of mind. There were two things which were rather disagreeable, but these two circumstances were drowned in the sea of joviality which rolled its billows in Stepan Arkadyevitch's soul. These two circumstances were, in the first place, when the evening before he had met Alexey Alexandrovitch on the street, he had perceived that he was stern and cold, and uniting the fact that Alexey Alexandrovitch had not called or sent word of his presence with certain rumours that had reached his ears about his sister's relations with Vronsky, Stepan Arkadyevitch suspected serious trouble between the husband and wife. This was one unpleasant thing. The second slight shadow was the fact that the new nachalnik, like all new chiefs, had the reputation of being a terribly exacting man, who got up at 6 o'clock, worked like a horse, and demanded similar zeal from his subordinates. Moreover, this new nachalnik had the reputation of being a regular bear in his manners, and was, according to rumour, a man of the opposite party from that to which his predecessor had belonged, and to which Stepan Arkadyevitch himself had up to that time also belonged. The afternoon before, Stepan Arkadyevitch had appeared at the office in full uniform, and the new nachalnik had been very cordial, and had talked with Oblonsky as with an old friend. Consequently, he thought it his duty to pay him an unofficial visit. The thought that the new nachalnik might not receive him cordially was a second disturbing element. But Stepan Arkadyevitch felt instinctively that all would be arranged to perfection. All people, all men, are transgressors as well as we. Why get angry and quarrel? He said to himself as he went to the hotel. "How are you, Vasily?" said he, as he went through the corridor with his hat cocked on one side, and met a lackey of his acquaintance. "Have you sacrificed your whiskers? Levin? In number 7. Please show me. Thanks. Do you know, is Count Anichkin at home?" This was the new nachalnik. "At your service," said Vasily with a smile. "We have not seen you for a long time. I was here yesterday, but came up another stairway. Is this number 7? When Stepan Arkadyevitch entered, Levin was standing in the middle of his room with a muzhik from Tver, measuring a bearskin. "Ah, did you kill him?" cried Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Splendid skin! A bear! How are you, Arkhip?" He held out his hand to the peasant, and then sat down in his paletot and hat. "Take off your coat and stay a while," said Levin, taking his hat. "I haven't time. I only came in for a little second," replied Oblonsky. He unbuttoned his paletot, then took it off and stayed a whole hour to talk with Levin about the hunt and other subjects. "Well now, tell me, please, what you did while you were abroad. Where have you been?" he asked after the peasant had gone. "I went to Germany, to France, and England, but only to the manufacturing centres, and not to the capitals. I saw a great deal that was new. I am glad I went." Yes, I know your ideas about organized labor." "Oh, no. In Russia there can be no labor question. The question of the working man doesn't concern us. The only important question for Russia is the relation of the workman to the soil. The question exists there, but it is impossible to remedy it there. While here—" Oblonsky listened attentively. Yes, said he. "It is possible that you are right, but I am glad that you are in better spirits. You hunt the bear, you work, you are enthusiastic. Shtcherbatsky told me that he had found you blue and melancholy, talking of nothing but death." "What of that? I am continually thinking of death," replied Levin. "It's true that there is a time to die, and that all is vanity. But I will tell you honestly, I set great value on my thought and work. But think of this world, just take notice, this world of ours, a little mold making the smallest of the planets, and we imagine that our ideas, our works, are something grand. It's all grains of dust." "All that is as old as the hills, brother." "It is old. But you see when this idea becomes clear to us, how miserable life seems. When we know that death will surely come, and that there will be nothing left of us, the most important things seem as insignificant as the turning over of this bearskin. And so in order to keep away thoughts of death, we hunt and work and try to divert ourselves." Stepan Arkadyevitch smiled, and gave Levin one of his affectionate looks. "Well, of course, here you come to me, and you pounce on me because I seek pleasure in life. Be not so severe, O moralist." "All the same, there is some good in life," replied Levin, becoming confused. "Well, I don't know. I only know that we must soon die." "Why soon?" "And you know that there is less charm in life when we think of death, but more restfulness." "On the contrary, we must enjoy what there is of it, anyway. But," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, rising for the 10th time, "I must go." "Oh, no, stay a little longer," said Levin, holding him back. "When shall we see each other again? I leave tomorrow." "I am a queer fellow. This is what I came for. Don't fail to come and dine with us today. Your brother will be with us, and my brother-in-law, Karenina, will be there." "Is he here?" asked Levin, and he wanted to ask about Kitty. He had heard that she had been in Petersburg at the beginning of the winter, visiting her sister, the wife of a diplomatist, and he did not know whether she had returned or not, but he hesitated about asking. "Whether she has come back or not, it's all the same. I will accept," he thought. "Will you come?" "Well, of course I will." "At 5 o'clock, in ordinary dress." And Stepan Arkadyevitch rose and went down to see the new nachalnik. Instinct had not deceived him. This dreadful man proved to be a great fellow. Stepan Arkadyevitch lunched with him, and stayed so long to talk that it was nearly 4 o'clock when he got to Alexey Alexandrovitch's room. Chapter 7. Alexey Alexandrovitch, after he returned from Mass, spent the morning in his room. He had 2 things to accomplish on this day. First, to receive a deputation of the foreign population, which was on its way to Petersburg, and happened just at that time to be at Moscow, and he wanted to instruct them as to what they should say. And then to write to his lawyer, as he had promised. The deputation, although it had been appointed at Alexey Alexandrovitch's invitation, was likely to cause great embarrassment and even to be a source of peril, and Alexey Alexandrovitch was very glad to meet it in Moscow. The members of the deputation had not the slightest comprehension of their duties and obligations. They were perfectly persuaded that their work consisted in exposing their needs and explaining the actual state of affairs and asking governmental assistance. And they really could not comprehend that some of their statements and demands gave color to the arguments of the hostile party and therefore spoiled the whole business. Alexey Alexandrovitch had a long discussion with them, made out a program from which they were not to deviate on any account in their dealings with the government, and, when they left him, gave them letters of introduction to various persons in Petersburg so that they might be properly treated. The Countess Lidia Ivanovna would be his principal auxiliary in this matter. She had a specialty for deputations, and knew better than anybody else how to manage them. When he had finished this business, Alexey Alexandrovitch wrote to his lawyer. Without the slightest misgiving, he gave him full power to do as he thought best, and sent 3 notes from Vronsky to Anna, which he had found in the portfolio. Since Alexey Alexandrovitch had left home with the intention of never returning to his family, and since his interview with the lawyer, when he had confided to one person at least his intentions, and especially since he had transferred this episode of his life to a documentary basis, he had become more and more settled in his convictions, and was now perfectly clear in his mind that what he wished could be accomplished. Just as he was sealing his letter, he heard Stepan Arkadyevitch's loud voice asking the servant if his brother-in-law was at home, and insisting on being announced. "It's all the same," thought Alexey Alexandrovitch, "or rather, so much the better. I will explain to him my position in regard to his sister, and he will understand that it is impossible for me to dine at his house. Come in," he cried, gathering up his papers and pushing them into a writing-case. "There now, you see you lied, and he is at home," said Stepan Arkadyevitch to the servant, who would not let him in. Then, taking off his overcoat, as he walked along, he came to Alexey Alexandrovitch's room. "I am delighted to find you," he began gaily. "I hope—" "I cannot go," said Alexey Alexandrovitch coldly, receiving his brother-in-law standing, and not asking him to sit down. Alexey Alexandrovitch resolved to adopt with his wife's brother the cool relations which seemed proper since he had decided to get a divorce. But he did not reckon on that sea of kind-heartedness which was always overflowing its banks in Stepan Arkadyevitch's heart. Stepan Arkadyevitch opened wide his bright, clear eyes. "Why can't you come? What do you mean?" he asked in French with some hesitation. "But you promised to come, and we all are counting on you." "I wish to tell you that I cannot come because our family relations must be broken." "How is that? Why?" said Oblonsky with a smile. "Because I have commenced an action for getting a divorce from my wife, your sister. I must—" But Alexey Alexandrovitch did not finish his sentence, for Stepan Arkadyevitch acted in a manner quite contrary to his expectations. Stepan Arkadyevitch sank into an armchair with a deep sigh. "Alexey Alexandrovitch, it can't be possible!" he cried, with pain expressed in his face. "It is true." "Pardon me, I cannot believe it." Alexey Alexandrovitch sat down. He felt that his words had not produced the effect that he had looked for, and that whatever explanation he might make, his relations with Oblonsky would remain the same. "Yes, it is a cruel necessity, but I am forced to demand the divorce," he replied. "I will say only one thing to you, Alexey Alexandrovitch. I know that you are a man of principle, and I know Anna is one of the best of women. Excuse me if I cannot change my opinion of her. I cannot believe it. There must be some misunderstanding." "Yes, if it were only a misunderstanding." "Excuse me, I understand. But I beg of you, do not be in haste," interrupted Stepan Arkadyevitch. "I have done nothing hastily," said Alexey Alexandrovitch coldly. "But in such a case one cannot ask advice of anybody. I am decided." "This is terrible!" exclaimed Stepan Arkadyevitch with a deep sigh. "I would do one thing, Alexey Alexandrovitch. I beseech you to do this," said he. "Proceedings, as I understand, have not yet begun. Before you do anything, talk with my wife. She loves Anna like a sister. She loves you, and she is a woman of good sense. For God's sake, talk with her. Do me this favor, I beg of you." Alexey Alexandrovitch deliberated, and Stepan Arkadyevitch looked at him sympathetically, not breaking in on his silence. "Will you come to her?" "Well, I don't know. That is the reason I did not call at your house. I suppose our relations ought to be broken off." "Why should they be? I don't see that. Allow me to believe that apart from our family connection, you have toward me, to a certain extent at least, the same friendly sentiments which I have always felt toward you, and genuine regard," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, pressing his hand. "Even if your worst surmises were justified, I should never take it on myself to criticize either side, and I see no reason why our relations should be changed. But now do this. Come and see my wife." "Well, you and I look on this matter differently," said Alexey Alexandrovitch coldly. "However, we will not discuss it." "No, but why should you not come and dine with us, at least today? My wife expects you. Please come, and above all talk with her. She is, I assure you, a superior woman. For God's sake come, I beg you on my knees." "If you wish it so much, I will go," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, sighing, and to change the conversation he asked Stepan Arkadyevitch about a matter which interested them both, about the new nachalnik, a man still young, who had suddenly received such an important appointment. Alexey Alexandrovitch had never liked Count Anitchkin, and had always differed with him about many questions, and now he could not help a feeling of envy natural to an official who had suffered defeat in his work and saw a younger man receiving advancement. "Well, have you met him yet?" asked Alexey Alexandrovitch with a venomous smile. "Oh, yes, he was with us yesterday at the session. He seems like a man very well informed and very active." "Active? But how does he employ his activity?" exclaimed Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Is it in doing his work, or in destroying what others have done before him? The plague of our government is this scribbling bureaucracy, of which Anitchkin is a worthy representative." "Truly, I don't know how this criticism applies to him. I don't even know his tendencies. At any rate, he is a very good fellow," replied Stepan Arkadyevitch. "I have just been with him. A very good fellow. We lunched together, and I taught him how to make a drink, you know, wine and oranges. He liked it very much. No, he is a fine young man." Stepan Arkadyevitch looked at his watch. "Ah, Batoishki, it is after 4 o'clock, and I have still to see Dolgovushin. It is decided, then, that you will dine with us, isn't it? Both my wife and myself will feel really hurt if you refuse to come." Alexey Alexandrovitch took leave of his brother-in-law very differently from the way in which he had greeted him. "I have promised, and I will come," he replied in a melancholy tone. "Believe me, I appreciate it, and I hope you will not regret it," said Stepan Arkadyevitch with a smile. And putting on his overcoat in the hall, he shook his fist at the servant's head, laughed, and went out. "At 5 o'clock, remember, and in ordinary dress," he called back once more, returning to the door. Chapter 8. It was already 6 o'clock, and several guests had come when the master of the house entered, meeting Sergey Ivanovitch Koznuishev and Pestov at the door. These were the two chief representatives of Moscow intellect, as Oblonsky had called them, and were men of distinction both by wit and character. They valued each other, but on almost every topic were absolutely and hopelessly at odds, not because they belonged to opposing parties, but precisely because they were of the same camp. Their enemies confounded them in one, but in this camp they each had their shades of opinion. Now there is nothing more conducive to disagreement than dissent in small particulars, and so they not only never agreed in their opinions, but never failed to laugh at each other good-naturedly for their incorrigible mistakes. They reached the door, talking about the weather, just as Stepan Arkadyevitch overtook them. The old prince, Alexander Dmitrievitch Shtcherbatsky, young Shtcherbatsky, Turovtsin, Kitty, and Karenina were already in the drawing-room. Stepan Arkadyevitch instantly perceived that matters in the drawing-room were going badly without him. Darya Alexandrovna, in her best grey silk gown, especially preoccupied with the children, who should have been eating their supper in the nursery by themselves, and anxious because her husband was late, did not succeed very well in entertaining her guests. All were sitting like a pope's daughters making a call, as the old prince expressed it, evidently perplexed to know why they had come, and with difficulty finding a few words so that the silence might not be absolute. The good-natured Turovtsin apparently felt out of his sphere, and the smile on his thick lips when he greeted Stepan Arkadyevitch spoke louder than words. "Well, my dear fellow, you have got me here with clever people. We are making merry here. It is a regular château de fleurs. I am doing my part." The old prince was sitting in silence, looking out of the corner of his bright eyes at Stepan Arkadyevitch, and Stepan Arkadyevitch perceived that he was trying to think up something worth saying to make an impression on this great statesman who was being served up like a sterlet for the benefit of the guests. Kitty kept glancing at the door, trying with all her might not to be caught blushing when Konstantin Levin should appear. Young Shtcherbatsky, who had not been presented to Karenina, was trying to show that this did not cause him any constraint. Karenin himself was in a black coat and white necktie, according to the Petersburg custom, and Stepan Arkadyevitch, perceived by his face that he had come only to keep his promise, and by mingling in the society was performing a burdensome task. He, more than any one else, was the cause of the chill which froze all the guests into silence until Stepan Arkadyevitch made his appearance. As soon as Stepan Arkadyevitch entered the drawing-room, he made his excuses, and explained that he had been detained by a certain prince who was always his scapegoat for all his delays and absences. In a twinkling he presented his guests to one another, furnished Koznuishev and Karenin a subject of conversation, the Russification of Poland, which they instantly grappled with, also enlisting Pestov in the discussion. Then, tapping Tarantsuin on the shoulder, he whispered some jest into his ear, and sat him down between his wife and Prince Shtcherbatsky. Then he complimented Kitty on her beauty, and introduced young Shtcherbatsky to Karenin. In a twinkling he had so worked on all this mass of social dough that it began to seem like a salon, and the voices intermingled in gay confusion. Konstantin Levin was the only guest not on hand. But even this was a fortunate circumstance, because when Stepan Arkadyevitch went into the dining-room, he discovered to his dismay that the port and sherry had come from Desprez, and not from Levy, and he seized the opportunity to send the coachman in all haste to Levy's, and then he returned to the drawing-room. Levin met him at the door of the drawing-room. "I am not late, am I?" "How could you be?" replied Stepan Arkadyevitch, taking him by the arm. "Are there many people here? Who are they?" asked Levin, blushing involuntarily, and with his glove brushing away the snow from his hat. "No one but relatives. Kitty is here. Come, let me present you to Karenin." Stepan Arkadyevitch, notwithstanding his liberal views, knew that a presentation to Karenin could not fail to be flattering, and therefore he regaled his best friends with this pleasure. But at this moment Konstantin Levin was not in a condition to appreciate all the satisfaction which this acquaintance would afford. He had not seen Kitty since that well-remembered evening when he met Vronsky, except for that glimpse of her which he had as she sat in her carriage. In the depth of his heart he knew that he was to see her this evening, but in his attempt to preserve all the freedom of his thoughts, he had tried to persuade himself that he did not know it. And now, as he learned that she was there, he suddenly felt such timidity and at the same time such terror that he could hardly breathe, and he found it impossible to say what he wanted to say. How will she seem? Just as she used to? Suppose Darya Alexandrovna was right. Why wasn't she right? He thought. "Oh, present me to Karenin, I beg of you," he succeeded in stammering, as he entered the drawing-room with the courage of despair, and saw her. She was neither as she had been in old time, nor as she had been in the carriage. She was altogether different. She was nervous, timid, modest, and therefore even more charming than ever. She saw him the moment he entered the drawing-room. She had been watching for him, and she felt so glad and so confused by reason of her gladness that at one moment especially when, after greeting Dolly, he looked at her, she was afraid of bursting into tears. Levin and Dolly both noticed it. She blushed and turned pale, and blushed again. She was so agitated that her lips trembled. Levin approached her, and bowed, and silently offered his hand. Had it not been for the slight trembling of her lips and the moisture that suffused her eyes and increased their brilliancy, her smile would have been almost serene as she said, "How long it is since we have met," and at the same time with a sort of desperate resolution put her cold hand into his. "You have not seen me, but I saw you one day," said Levin, with a smile of radiant happiness. "I saw you when you were going from the railway station to Yergoshovo." "When was it?" asked she, in surprise. "You were on your way to Yergoshovo," said Levin, feeling that the joy which flooded his soul was suffocating him. How, he thought, could I have dared to associate anything but innocence with this fascinating creature? Yes, Darya Alexandrovna was right. Stepan Arkadyevitch came to conduct him to Karenin. "Allow me to make you acquainted," said he, calling each by name. "It is very pleasant to meet you again," said Alexey Alexandrovitch coolly, as he shook Levin's hand. "What? Do you already know each other?" asked Oblonsky with surprise. We travelled together for 3 hours, said Levin, smiling, but we parted as from a masked ball, very much mystified. At least, it was the case with me. Really? Will you pass into the dining-room? Said Stepan Arkadyevitch, pointing toward the door. The gentleman walked into the dining-room, and went to a table laden with a zakuska, which was composed of 6 kinds of vodka, as many varieties of cheese with silver shovels, and without, caviar, herring, preserves of different kinds, and platefuls of French bread sliced thin. The men stood around the table, and, while waiting for the dinner, the conversation between Sergei Ivanovitch, Kozneushchev, Karenin, and Pestov about the Russification of Poland began to languish. Sergei Ivanovitch, who had a faculty peculiar to himself for ending even the most absorbing and serious dispute, by an unexpected infusion of Attic salt, and so putting the disputants into a better frame of mind, did this now. Alexey Alexandrovitch was trying to prove that the Russification of Poland could be accomplished only by means of the highest principles, and that these ought to be introduced by the Russian administration. Pestov maintained that one nation could only assimilate another by surpassing it in density of population. Kozneushchev, with certain restrictions, shared the opinions of both, and to close this serious conversation with a joke, he added, as they left the drawing-room, smiling, "The most logical way, then, for us to assimilate foreigners, it seems to me, is to have as many children as possible. It is there where my brother and I are in fault, while you married gentlemen, and especially you, Stepan Arkadyevitch, are acting the part of good patriots. How many have you?" he asked of the host, handing him a very diminutive glass. Everybody laughed, and Oblonsky most of all. "Yes, that is certainly the best means," said he, taking a bite of cheese and pouring some special kind of vodka into the glass that Kozneushchev offered him. But the jest really served to bring the discussion to a close. "This cheese is not bad. What do you say?" remarked the host. "Do you still practice gymnastics?" said Oblonsky, addressing Levin, and with his left hand feeling his friend's muscles. Levin smiled and doubled up his arm, and Stepan Arkadyevitch felt how under his fingers the biceps swelled up like a round cheese beneath the smooth cloth of his coat. "What biceps! A Samson!" said he. "I suppose it is necessary to be endowed with remarkable strength to hunt bears, isn't it?" said Alexey Alexandrovitch, smearing some cheese on a piece of bread as thin as a cobweb. His ideas about hunting were of the vaguest. Levin smiled. "No, on the contrary, a child could kill a bear." And he drew back with a slight bow to make room for the ladies, who with the hostess were coming to the zakuska table. "I hear that you have just killed a bear," said Kitty, vainly trying to put her fork into a recalcitrant mushroom which kept flying about the plate, and as she threw back the lace in her sleeve there was a glimpse of a white arm. "Are there really bears where you live?" she added, half turning her pretty face toward him and smiling. What she said had no especial importance, but what significance inexpressible in words there was for him in the sound of her voice, in every motion of her lips, of her eyes, hands, when she said it. It implied an entreaty for forgiveness, an expression of faith in him, a sweet and timid caress, and a promise, and a hope, and love for him, and he could not help believing in it, and his heart was filled with happiness. "Oh, no, we were hunting in the government at Tver, and on my way from there I met your brother-in-law, Stiva's brother-in-law, in the train," said he, smiling. "The meeting was very funny." And he gave a lively and amusing description of how, after having been awake all night, he forced his way into Karenin's car in a sheepskin jacket. "The conductor, contrary to the proverb, judging by first impressions, wanted to put me out, and there I was beginning to express myself in sublime style, and... Well, sir, you also," said he, addressing Karenin and not recollecting his name. "You got your first impression from my Polushka book, and were for expelling me, but afterward you took my part, for which I felt very grateful to you." "Travellers' rights to their choice of place are generally too little considered," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, wiping the ends of his fingers with his napkin. "Oh, I noticed that you were dubious about me," replied Levin, smiling good-naturedly. "That was why I hastened to open a serious subject of conversation, to make you forget my sheepskin. Kosnuishev, who was talking with the mistress of the house, and at the same time listening with one ear to what his brother said, glanced at him. "What is the matter with him tonight? What makes him look so triumphant?" he asked himself. He did not know Levin felt as if he had wings. Levin knew that she was listening to him. She was taking pleasure in what he said, and this was the only thing that interested him. He was alone with her, not only in this room, but in the whole world. He felt that he was on a dizzy height, and there far below him were all these excellent people, Oblonsky, Karenin, and the rest of humanity. Stepan Arkadyevitch seemed entirely to forget Levin and Kitty in placing his guests at table until all but 2 of the seats were assigned. Then he put them side by side. "Well, you can sit there," he said to Levin. The dinner was as elegant as the appointments, for Stepan Arkadyevitch was a great connoisseur in such matters. The Marie-Louise soup was perfect. The little pierogi or pasties which melted in the mouth were irreproachable, and Matva, with 2 waiters in white cravats, skillfully and noiselessly served the roast and the wine. On the material side the dinner was a success. It was not less so on the non-material side. The conversation was sometimes general, sometimes special, but it never lagged, and toward the end of the dinner it had grown so animated that when they left the table the men could not drop their interesting topics, and even Alexey Alexandrovitch was thawed out. End of chapter 9. Pestov, who liked to discuss a question thoroughly, was not satisfied with what Kosnuishev had said. He felt that he had not been allowed to express his thoughts sufficiently. "In speaking of the density of the population," said he, after the soup, addressing Alexey Alexandrovitch, "I didn't intend to make it the principle of an assimilation, but only a means." "It seems to me that amounts to the same thing," replied Karenin, slowly and indolently. "In my judgment, a people can have no influence over another people, unless it has the highest development, which—" "That is precisely the question," interrupted Pestov, who always spoke with so much ardor that he seemed to put his whole soul into defending his own opinions. "How is one to decide on what is the highest development? Which stands on the highest plane of civilization, the English, the French, or the Germans? Which nation is to naturalize the others? We have seen the Rhine made French, but are the Germans inferior? No, there is some other law," he cried, in his bass voice. "I believe that the balance will always turn in favor of true civilization," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, slightly raising his brows. "But what are the signs of this true civilization?" demanded Pestov. "I suppose these signs are known," replied Alexey Alexandrovitch. "But are they really known?" suggested Sergey Ivanovitch, with a subtle smile. "It is now admitted that our present civilization can't be anything else than classical, but we have furious debates on this point, and it cannot be denied that each side brings forward strong proofs in its favor." "Are you in favor of the classics, Sergey Ivanovitch?" said Oblonsky. "Shall I give you some claret?" "I am not expressing my personal opinions regarding either form of civilization," replied Kosnuishev, with a smile of condescension such as he would have shown a child as he reached out his glass. "I only say that both sides have strong arguments," continued he, addressing Alexey Alexandrovitch. "My education was classical, but in this controversy I personally cannot find any room to stand. I do not see any clear proofs that the classics must take precedence over the sciences." "The natural sciences tend just as much to the pedagogical development of the human mind," replied Pestov. "Take astronomy, take botany and zoology, each with its system of general laws." "It seems to me impossible to deny that the very process of learning the forms of languages has a specially beneficial influence on mental development. Moreover, it must be admitted that the influence of the classic writers is eminently moral, while, unfortunately for us, the study of the natural sciences has been complicated with false and fatal doctrines, which are the bane of our time." Sergey Ivanovitch was going to reply, but Pestov interrupted him in his deep voice. He began heatedly to demonstrate the incorrectness of this statement. Kosnuishev calmly waited his chance to speak, evidently feeling that it would be a victorious rejoinder. But, said he, smiling shrewdly, and addressing Alexey Alexandrovitch, it cannot be denied that it is a difficult matter completely to balance all the advantages and disadvantages of the two systems of science, and that the question which is preferable could not be decided so quickly and definitely if there were not on the side of the classical civilization that advantage which you just called the moral, désensement, the anti-nihilistic influence. Undoubtedly. If it were not for this advantage of the anti-nihilistic influence welded by classic education, we should rather hesitate. We should weigh the arguments of both sides, said Sergey Ivanovitch with his shrewd smile. We should give scope to both tendencies. But now we know that in classical education lies the medical power of anti-nihilism, and we boldly administer it like a pill to our patients. But are we perfectly sure of the healing properties of these pills? He said in conclusion, pouring out his Attic salt. Sergey Ivanovitch's pills made everyone laugh. Turovtsin more boisterously and heartily than the rest, for he had been on the lookout for something amusing to laugh at ever since the conversation began. Stepan Arkadyevitch had made no mistake in counting on Pestov. Pestov never allowed an intellectual conversation to flag for a moment. Kosnuishev had hardly finished with his jest when Pestov began again. One cannot even agree with this idea, said he, that morality has this aim. Morality is evidently controlled by general considerations and remains indifferent to the influences of the measures which may be taken. For example, the question of higher education for women should be regarded as dangerous, yet the government opens the public lectures and the universities to women. And the conversation immediately leaped to the new theme of the education of women. Alexey Alexandrovitch expressed the thought that the education of women was too much confused with the question of the emancipation of women, and could be considered dangerous only from that point of view. I believe, on the contrary, that these two questions are intimately connected, said Pestov. It is a vicious circle. Woman is deprived of rights because she is deprived of education, and her lack of education comes from the absence of rights. Let us not forget that the bondage of women is so ancient, so interwoven with our customs, that we are very often incapable of understanding the legal abyss that separates her from us. You speak of rights, said Sergey Ivanovitch, as soon as he had a chance to put in a word. Is it a right to fulfill the functions of juror, of municipal councillor, of president of the tribunal, of public functionary, of member of parliament? Without a doubt. But if women can exceptionally fill these functions, then it seems to me we make a mistake in using the word rights. It would be fairer to say duties. Everyone agrees that in fulfilling the function of a juror, of town councillor, of telegraph employer, we are fulfilling a duty. Let us say, then, that women are seeking for duties, and legitimately enough. In this case we may sympathize with their desire to take part in a man's work. That is perfectly fair, affirmed Alexey Alexandrovitch. The question, I suspect, consists in deciding whether they are capable of fulfilling these duties. And they will be, certainly, as soon as they have been generally educated, said Stepan Arkadyevitch. We see it. And the proverb? Asked the old prince, whose little scornful eyes shone as he listened to this conversation. I may repeat it before my daughters. Long hair. That is the way we judge the negroes before their emancipation, said Pestov with dissatisfaction. What astonishes me, said Sergey Ivanovitch, is that women are seeking new duties, when we see, unfortunately, that men generally shirk theirs. Duties are accompanied by rights, honor, influence, money. These are what women are after, said Pestov. Exactly as if I solicited the right to become a wet nurse, and found it hard to be refused, while women are paid for it, said the old prince. Turovtsin burst out laughing, and Sergey Ivanovitch regretted that he had not said that. Even Alexey Alexandrovitch smiled. Yes, but a man can't be a wet nurse, said Sergey Ivanovitch, but a woman. But what is a young girl without any family going to do? Asked Stepan Arkadyevitch, who found reason to sympathize with Pestov, as he thought of his little ballet girl, Chibisovaya. If you look closely into the lives of these young girls," said Darya Alexandrovna, unexpectedly taking part in the conversation and showing some irritation, for it was evident that she suspected what sort of women Stepan Arkadyevitch meant, "you will doubtless find that they have left a family or a sister, and that women's work was within their reach." "But we are defending a principle, an ideal," answered Pestov in his ringing bass. "Woman claims the right to be independent and educated. She suffers from her consciousness of being unable to accomplish this." "And I suffer from not being admitted as nurse to the foundling asylum," repeated the old prince, to the great amusement of Tarotsuin, letting the large end of a piece of asparagus fall into his sauce. End of chapter 10. All took part in the general conversation except Kitty and Levin. At first, when they were talking about the influence of one people over another, Levin recalled what he had to say on this subject, but his thoughts, which at one time had seemed to him very important, simply flashed through his mind like notions in a dream, and now had not the least interest for him. He even thought it strange that people could trouble themselves about such useless questions. Kitty, for her part, ought to have been interested in what was said about women's rights and education. How many times had she pondered over these subjects as she remembered her friend Varenka, whose dependence was so hard to bear? How many times had she thought what she herself would do in case she should not marry? How often had she disputed with her sister on the subject? But now it did not interest her in the least. She and Levin had their own talk, and yet it was not a conversation so much as it was a mysterious affinity, which brought them nearer and nearer to each other, and filled them with a joyful timidity before the unknown they were about to enter. At first Kitty asked how he happened to see her in the summer, and Levin told her that he was returning from the hayfields by the highway after the mowing. "It was very early in the morning. You had probably just waked. Your maman was asleep in her corner. It was a marvelous morning. I was walking along, saying to myself, 'A carriage with 4 horses. Whose can it be?' They were 4 fine horses with bells, and quick as a flash you passed by. I saw you through the door. You were sitting like this, holding the ribbons of your bonnet in your hands, and you seemed awfully deep in thought. How I wished I could know," he added with a smile, "what you were thinking about. Was it something very important?" "Wasn't my hair in disorder?" thought Kitty, but seeing the enthusiastic smile that lighted up Levin's face, she felt that on the contrary the impression she had produced was good, and she replied, blushing and laughing merrily, "Truly, I don't remember." "How heartily Tarotsuin laughs," said Levin, looking at his moist eyes and his sides shaking with laughter. "Have you known him long?" asked Kitty. "Who doesn't know him?" "And I see that you think he is a bad man." "Not bad, but he doesn't amount to much." "That is unjust. I beg you not to think so any more," said Kitty. "I, too, once had a very poor opinion of him, but he is a sweet-tempered and wonderfully good man. His heart is gold." "How can you know what kind of heart he has?" "We are great friends. I know him very well. Last winter, a short time after you were at our house," she said rather guiltily, but with a confiding smile, "Dolly's children had the scarlatina, and one day Tarotsuin happened to call on my sister. Would you believe it?" she said, lowering her voice. "He was so sorry for her that he stayed to take care of the little invalids. For 3 weeks he played nurse to the children. I am telling Konstantin Dmitrich of Tarotsuin's kindness at the time of the scarlatina," said she, turning to her sister. "Yes, it was remarkable. It was lovely," replied Dolly, looking with a grateful smile at Tarotsuin, who was conscious that they were talking about him. Levin also looked at him, and was surprised that he had never understood him till then. "I plead guilty, and I will never again think ill of people," he said, gaily, speaking honestly, exactly as he thought at the time. End of chapter 11. The discussion about the emancipation of women led to talk about the inequality of rights in marriage, and this was a ticklish subject to speak about in the presence of the ladies. Pestov during the dinner several times touched on this question, but Sergey Ivanovitch and Stepan Arkadyevitch warily diverted him from it. But as soon as dinner was over and the ladies had retired, Pestov addressed Alexey Alexandrovitch and attempted to explain the chief cause of this inequality. The inequality of rights between husband and wife in marriage depended, in his opinion, on the fact that the infidelity of a wife and that of a husband was unequally punished, both by law and by public opinion. Stepan Arkadyevitch hastened over to Alexey Alexandrovitch and offered him a cigar. "No, I do not smoke," replied Karenin, calmly, and as if to prove that he was not afraid of this conversation, he turned toward Pestov with his icy smile. "I imagine that such a view is based on the very nature of things," said he, and he started to go to the drawing-room. But here Tarapsuin suddenly spoke up, addressing Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Have you heard the story about Pryatchnikov?" he asked. He was animated by the champagne, and had been impatiently waiting for a chance to break a silence which weighed heavily upon him. "Vasya Pryatchnikov?" he repeated, with a good-natured smile on his thick lips, red and moist, and he addressed Alexey Alexandrovitch as the most important guest. "I was told this morning that he fought a duel at Tver with Kvitsky and killed him." As it always seems as if a sore spot were peculiarly liable to be hit, so now Stepan Arkadyevitch thought the conversation was fated every moment to touch Alexey Alexandrovitch on the sore spot. He was on the point of going to his brother-in-law's assistance, but Alexey Alexandrovitch asked, with curiosity, "Why did Pryatchnikov fight a duel?" "On account of his wife. He behaved bravely about it. He challenged the other man and killed him." "Ah," said Alexey Alexandrovitch with unconcern, and, raising his eyebrows, he went to the drawing-room. Dolly met him in a little parlour leading into the drawing-room, and said, smiling timidly, "How glad I am that you came. I want to talk with you. Let us sit down here." Alexey Alexandrovitch, preserving the air of indifference caused by his elevated eyebrows, sat down near her, pretending to smile. "All the more willingly," said he, "as I wish to ask you to excuse me for leaving you as soon as possible. I have to go away tomorrow morning." Darya Alexandrovna was firmly convinced of Anna's innocence, and she was conscious of growing pale and trembling with anger before this heartless, unfeeling man, who coolly proposed to ruin her innocent friend. "Alexey Alexandrovitch," she said with desperate firmness, looking him full in the face, "I asked you about Anna, and you did not reply. How is she?" "I think that she is well, Darya Alexandrovna," replied Karenin, without looking at her. "Pardon me, I have no right to insist on it, but I love Anna like a sister. Tell me, I beseech you, what has happened between you and her, and what do you accuse her of?" Alexey Alexandrovitch frowned and bent his head, almost closing his eyes. "Your husband must have told you, I think, the reasons which oblige me to break my relations with Anna Arkadyevna," said he, avoiding her eyes but casting a glance of annoyance at Shtcherbatsky, who was passing through the room. "I do not believe it. I do not believe it, and I cannot believe it," murmured Dolly, pressing her thin hands together energetically. She rose quickly and, touching Alexey Alexandrovitch's arm, said, "We shall be disturbed here. Let us go in there, please." Dolly's emotion communicated itself to Alexey Alexandrovitch. He arose and submissively followed her into the children's schoolroom. They seated themselves at a table covered with an oilcloth, hacked with penknives. "I don't believe it. I don't believe it," repeated Dolly, trying to catch his eye, which avoided hers. "One cannot deny facts, Darya Alexandrovna," said he, dwelling on the word facts. "But what has she done?" insisted Darya Alexandrovna. "Precisely what has she done?" "She has failed to do her duty, and been false to her husband. That is what she has done," said he. "No, no, it is impossible. No, thank the Lord, you are mistaken," cried Dolly, putting her hands to her temples and closing her eyes. Alexey Alexandrovitch smiled coldly with his lips only. He wished to prove to Dolly, and to prove to himself, the firmness of his conviction, but this heated defence of his wife, though it did not shake him, irritated his wound. He spoke with more animation. It is difficult to make a mistake when a woman herself declares to her husband that 8 years of married life and a son count for nothing, and that she wishes to begin life over again, he repeated angrily, dilating his nostrils. Honour and vice! I cannot associate the two ideas. I cannot believe it. Darya Alexandrovna, said he, angrily, now looking straight at Dolly's distressed face, and feeling his tongue involuntarily unloosed, I would give a great deal to be able still to have any doubts. When I was in doubt about it, it was hard for me, but easier than it is now. When I doubted, there was still hope. Now there is no hope, and I have doubted everything. I am so full of doubt that I detest my son, and sometimes I do not believe that he is my son. I am very unhappy. He had no need to say that. Darya Alexandrovna understood it as soon as she looked into his face. She pitied him, and her faith in her friend's innocence was shaken. Oh, it is terrible, terrible! But is it true that you are really decided about the divorce? I have decided to take this last measure. There was nothing else for me to do. No, don't do it. Don't do it, cried Dolly, with tears in her eyes. No, don't do it. The most dreadful thing about a misfortune of this kind is that one cannot bear his cross as in any other, a loss or a death. And here one must do something, said he, apparently divining Dolly's thought. One must escape from the humiliating position in which one is placed. On ne peut vivre à trois. I understand perfectly, replied Dolly, bowing her head. She was silent, thinking of herself, of her own domestic troubles. But suddenly, with an energetic movement, she raised her head, and with a supplicating gesture she folded her hands. But wait, she said. You are a Christian. Think of her. What will become of her if you abandon her? I have thought of it, Darya Alexandrovna. I have thought a great deal about it, said Alexey Alexandrovitch. His face was covered with red blotches, and his troubled eyes looked straight at her. Darya Alexandrovna pitied him now from the bottom of her heart. I did this very thing after she herself told me of her disgrace. I put everything on the old footing. I gave her the chance of reformation. I tried to save her. What did she do then? She paid no attention to the easiest of demands, observance of propriety, he added, choking. One can save a man who does not want to perish, but if his whole nature is so corrupt, so rotten, that ruin itself seems salvation, what can be done? Everything except divorce, replied Darya Alexandrovna. What do you mean by everything? No, that is horrible. She will no longer be anyone's wife. She will be lost. What can I do? Replied Karenin, raising his shoulders and his eyebrow, and the memory of his wife's last offence so angered him that he became as cool as at the beginning of the conversation. I am very grateful to you for your sympathy, but I must go, he added, rising. No, wait a moment. You must not give her up. Listen to me. I speak from experience. I, too, was married, and my husband deceived me. In my jealousy and indignation, I wished to abandon everything, but I considered the matter. And who saved me? Anna. Now I am living again. Now my children are growing up. My husband has returned to his family, regrets his wrongdoing, is growing better, nobler. I live. I have forgiven him, and you ought to forgive her. Alexey Alexandrovitch listened, but Dolly's words had no effect on him. Again in his soul arose the anger of that day when he decided on a divorce. He shook himself and spoke in a loud, penetrating voice. I cannot, nor do I wish to forgive her. It would be unjust. I have done what was next to impossible for this woman, and she has trampled everything into the mire, which seems to be her element. I am not a bad man, and I have never hated anybody before, but her I hate, with all the strength of my soul, and I cannot forgive her, for I hate her too much for all the wrong she has done me." And tears of anger trembled in his voice. "Love them that hate you," murmured Dolly, almost ashamed. Alexey Alexandrovitch smiled scornfully. He was familiar with these words, but they did not apply to his case. "We can love those who hate us, but to love those whom we hate is impossible. I beg your pardon for having troubled you. Sufficient unto every man is his own burden." And having recovered his self-possession, Alexey Alexandrovitch calmly took leave of Dolly and went away. End of chapter 12. When the company arose from dinner, Levin wanted to follow Kitty into the drawing-room, but he was afraid, not that it would be disagreeable to her, but that it would be too obvious a wooing of her. So he remained with the men and took part in the general conversation. And without looking at Kitty, he was conscious of her motions, of her glances, and of the place where she was in the drawing-room. Without the least effort, he immediately began to fulfill the promise that he had made to her to love all men, and to think nothing but good of them. The conversation turned on the Commune in Russia, which Pestov considered as the beginning of what he called a new order of things. Levin agreed as little with him as he did with Sergei Ivanovitch, who it seemed to him recognized, and at the same time denied, the value of this institution. But he talked with them, trying only to reconcile them and tone down their excitability. He was not in the least interested in what he himself said, and was still less interested in what they said, but his one desire was to see all of them happy and contented. He now realized what one thing was important, and that one was at first yonder in the drawing-room, and afterward moved about and was now near the door. Without turning around he was conscious of a look and a smile fixed on him, and he could not help looking. She was standing there with Shtcherbatsky and looking at him. "I thought you were going to the piano," said he, approaching her. "Music is what I have to do without in the country." "No, we merely came to find you, and I thank you for coming to us," she replied, recompensing him with a smile. "What pleasure can there be in discussing? Really, no one ever convinced another." "Yes, that is true," said Levin. "It generally happens that you get excited in a discussion simply from the fact that you can never tell exactly what your opponent is trying to show." Levin had many times noticed that in discussions among clever people, after an immense output of energy, an immense array of logical terms and subtleties, the disputants came at last to an acknowledgment that what they had been so interminably striving to prove to each other was a matter of common knowledge from the very beginning, but that they liked something different, and therefore were not willing to acknowledge what they liked, so as not to be controverted. He had often met with the experience that in the midst of a dispute you find what your opponent likes, and suddenly you find that you yourself like the same thing, and you immediately agree, and then all your arguments fall to the ground as useless. But sometimes he had had the opposite experience. You at last say what you like and evolve your arguments, and if perchance you speak well and sincerely, suddenly your opponent assents and ceases to uphold the other side. This is exactly what he meant. She wrinkled her brows trying to comprehend, but as soon as he began to explain, her mind grasped his meaning. "I understand. One must make sure why he is disputing, what he likes, if possible." She had fully grasped and expressed his badly phrased idea. Levin smiled with rapture, so striking was the transition from the complicated prolix discussion between Pestov and his brother to this clear, laconic, almost wordless communication of the most abstruse thoughts. Shtcherbatsky stepped away, and Kitty, going to a card-table, sat down, and taking a piece of chalk in her hand, began to draw circles on the green cloth. They took up the topic which was under discussion at dinner, as to the emancipation and occupation of women. Levin was inclined to agree with Darya Alexandrovna that a girl who was not going to marry would find feminine occupations in some family. He urged that not a single family can get along without some female help, that every family, however poor or rich, has and must have someone to look after the children. "No," said Kitty, blushing, but looking at him frankly with her honest eyes. A girl may be so situated that she cannot without humiliation go into a family, but she herself—" He understood what she hinted at. "Oh, yes," he said. "Yes, yes, yes, you are right." And he realized all that Pestsov was trying to prove at dinner about the freedom of women, merely by the fact that he saw in Kitty's heart a maiden's dread of humiliation, and loving her, he experienced this dread and this humiliation, and immediately renounced his former arguments. A silence ensued. She went on making designs with the chalk on the table. Her eyes shone with a gentle gleam. Submitting to her mood, he felt in his being all the increasing tension of happiness. "Oh, I have covered the table with my scrawls," said she, laying down the chalk, with a movement as if she were going to rise. "How can I stay alone without her?" thought Levin, terrified, and picking up the chalk. "Wait," said he, sitting down at the table. "I've wanted for a long time to ask you something." He looked straight into her affectionate but nevertheless startled eyes. "Please, what is it?" "This is it," he said, taking the chalk and writing the letters WYS III WIITOA. These letters were the initials of the words, "When you said it is impossible, was it impossible then or always?" It was not at all likely that Kitty would be able to make out this complicated question. Levin looked at her, nevertheless, as if his life depended on whether she would guess these words or not. She looked at him gravely, then rested her forehead on her hand and tried to decipher it. Occasionally she would look up at him, asking him with her eyes, "Is what I think right?" "I know what it is," she said, blushing. "What is this word?" he asked, pointing to the I of the word impossible. "That letter stands for impossible. The word is not right," she replied. He quickly rubbed out what he had written, gave the chalk to her, and stood up. She wrote TICNAD. Dolly, seeing her sister with the chalk in her hand, a timid and happy smile on her lips, raising her eyes to Levin, who was leaning over the table, beaming now at her, now at the cloth, felt consoled for the grief caused by her conversation with Alexey Alexandrovitch. Her face suddenly grew radiant. He had understood the reply. Then I could not answer differently. He looked at Kitty timidly and inquiringly. "Only then?" "Yes," replied the young girl's smile. "BN, but now?" he asked. "Read this. I will tell you what I wish very much." And she quickly traced the initials TYMFAFWTP. This meant, "That you might forgive and forget what took place." He seized the chalk in turn with his excited, trembling fingers, and crushing it wrote down the initials of these words, "I have nothing to forgive and forget. I have never ceased to love you." Kitty looked at him, and her smile died away. "I understand," she murmured. He sat down and wrote a long phrase. She comprehended it, and without even asking it is thus and so, took the chalk and instantly replied. It was some time before he made out what she wrote, and had to keep looking into her eyes. His wits were dulled by his happiness. He could not supply the words which she intended, but in her lovely eyes, radiant with joy, he understood all that he needed to know. And he wrote 3 letters. But he had not finished writing them ere she read them under his hand, and herself finished the sentence and answered it, "Yes." "You are playing secrétaire, are you?" said the old prince, coming up to them. "Well, if you are going to the theatre, it is time to start." Levin rose and accompanied Kitty to the door. This conversation decided everything. Kitty had acknowledged her love for him, and had given him permission to come the next morning to speak to her parents. Chapter 13. After Kitty had gone and Levin was left alone, he felt such a restlessness and such an unendurable longing for the morning to come when he might see her again and settle his destiny forever, that he dreaded, as he dreaded death, the 14 hours which he should have to endure without her. He felt it absolutely necessary to be with and to talk with someone so as not to remain alone, so as to cheat the time. Stepan Arkadyevitch, whom he would have liked to keep with him, was going, so he said, to a reception, but in reality to the ballet. Levin could only tell him that he was happy, and should never, never forget what he owed to him. Stepan Arkadyevitch's eyes and smile showed Levin that he suitably appreciated his feelings. "What? Then you have nothing more to say about dying?" said Oblonsky, pressing his friend's hand affectionately. "No," replied the latter. Darya Alexandrovna, too, almost congratulated him when she bade him good night. She said, "How glad I am that you have made up with Kitty. We ought to prize old friends." And her words displeased Levin. She could not comprehend how lofty and inaccessible to her all this was for him, and she should not have dared to refer to it. Levin took his departure, but, to avoid being alone, he joined his brother. "Where are you going?" "To a meeting." "Well, I'll go with you. May I?" "Why not?" said Sergey Ivanovitch, smiling. "What has happened to you today?" "What has happened? Good fortune," said Levin, letting down the carriage window. "Have you any objection? I'm suffocating. Good fortune has happened to me. Why have you never been married?" Sergey Ivanovitch smiled. "I am delighted. She seems like a splendid he began. "No, don't say anything about it. Don't say anything about it," cried Levin, clutching the collar of his shuba with both hands and covering his face with the fur. A splendid girl! What commonplace words, and how feebly they corresponded to his feelings. Sergey Ivanovitch laughed a gay laugh. This was a rare occurrence with him. "I should think I might say that I am very glad of this." Tomorrow you may speak, but not another word now. Not another word. Not another word. Be silent," said Levin, and pulling his shuba still higher round his face, he added, "I love you very much. But tell me, may I go to your meeting?" "Of course you may." "What is the subject for your discussion tonight?" asked Levin, still smiling. They reached their destination. Levin heard the secretary stammer through the report, which evidently he did not understand, but he could see, from this secretary's face, that he was a good, amiable, sympathetic fellow. It was evident from the way he hesitated and became confused while reading. Then came the debates. They discussed about the disposal of certain sums of money and the laying of certain sewer pipes. Sergey Ivanovitch attacked two members of the commission and made a long, triumphant speech against them. After which another member, reading from a paper, after some timid hesitation, replied briefly in a charming though bitter fashion, and then Sviatsky, he too was there, in his turn expressed his opinions nobly and eloquently. Levin listened and clearly saw that neither the money to be expended nor the sewer pipes were of serious importance, and that they were not really quarreling, but were all such pleasant, congenial people, and consequently all was serene among them. They interfered with no one, and all seemed happy. Levin noticed with surprise that they all seemed to him today transparent, that, from some trifling incidents which once would have entirely escaped his notice, he could read their souls and see how good they all were. Especially did they seem to like him, Levin. This was shown by the way they talked with him, and even those who did not know him looked at him pleasantly and in a friendly manner. "Well, how did you like it?" asked Sergey Ivanovitch. "Very much. I never should have believed that it would be so interesting. It is splendid." Sviatsky approached Levin and invited him to come and take a cup of tea at his house. Levin could not for the life of him comprehend or remember why he had been prejudiced against Sviatsky, or what he had seemed to him to lack. He was a clever and wonderfully good fellow. "I should be delighted," replied Levin, and he immediately inquired after Madame Sviatsky and her sister. By a strange association of ideas, as Sviatsky's sister-in-law suggested marriage, he concluded that nobody would be more interested than she and her sister to hear of his happiness, so he was very much pleased with the idea of going to see them. Sviatsky questioned him about his affairs, always refusing to admit that anything could be discovered which had not already been discovered in Europe. But now his theory did not arouse Levin's opposition. On the contrary, he felt that Sviatsky was right, and Levin admired the gentleness and delicacy with which he avoided the expression of his arguments. The ladies were especially charming. It seemed to Levin that they all knew, and that they shared his joy, but that they avoided speaking of it from discretion. He remained for 3 hours, talking on various subjects, and continually alluding to what filled his soul, without noticing that he was mortally tiring his friends, and that they were falling asleep. At last, Sviazhsky, yawning, accompanied him to the vestibule, very much surprised at the strange state of mind in which his friend seemed to be. It was 2:00. Levin reached his hotel, and was aghast at the thought of passing the next 10 hours alone, a prey to his impatience. The watchman who was on duty in the corridor lighted his candles, and was about to withdraw when Levin stopped him. This fellow, who was called Yegor, and whom Levin had never before noticed, seemed like a good, intelligent man, and above all, kind-hearted. "Tell me, Yegor, don't you find it hard to go without your sleep?" "What can I do about it? It is our calling. We have an easier time in gentlemen's houses, but here we get larger wages." It seemed that Yegor was the father of a family of 4 children, 3 boys and a girl trained as a seamstress, whom he hoped to marry to a harness-maker's clerk. Levin seized this opportunity to communicate his ideas about love in marriage to Yegor, remarking that people are always happy when there is love, because their happiness is in themselves. Yegor listened attentively, and evidently understood Levin's meaning, but he confirmed it by an unexpected reflection, that when he, Yegor, had served good masters, he had always been satisfied with them, and that he was contented with his master now, although he was a Frenchman. "What a wonderfully good fellow," thought Levin. "Well, and did you love your wife, Yegor, when you married her?" "Why shouldn't I have loved her?" replied Yegor. And Levin noticed Yegor also grew very enthusiastic, and was eager to confide to him his inmost thoughts. "My life, too, has been extraordinary," he began, his eyes shining, overcome by Levin's enthusiasm as one catches a yawning fit. "From my childhood—" But the bell rang. Yegor departed, and Levin was left alone. He had eaten scarcely anything at dinner. He had refused to take any tea or supper at Sviazhsky's, yet even now he could not think of eating. He had not slept the preceding night, yet he did not think of sleeping now. His room was cold, but it seemed so stifling that he could not breathe. He opened both casements and sat down on a table in front of one. Above the roofs, covered with snow, rose the carved cross of a church, and higher still were the triangular constellation of the Charioteer and the bright yellow Capella. He breathed in the cold air which filled his room, and looked now at the cross, and now at the stars, rising as in a dream among the figures and memories called up by his imagination. Toward 4:00 in the morning he heard footsteps in the corridor. He opened his door and saw a gambler named MaryAnn, whom he knew, returning from his club. He walked along, coughing, gloomy and scowling. "Poor unfortunate fellow," thought Levin, and his eyes filled with tears of pity and love for that man. He wanted to stop him, to speak to him and console him, but, remembering that he was undressed, he thought better of it, went back and sat down to bathe himself in the icy air, and to look at the silent, foreign-looking cross, so full of meaning to him, and at the brilliant yellow star poised above it. Toward 7:00 the men polishing the floors began to make a noise. The bells rang for early morning service, and Levin began to feel that he was taking cold. He closed the window, made his toilet, and went out. End of chapter 14. The streets were still deserted. Levin walked to the Shtcherbatskys' house. The principal entrance was still closed, and everyone was asleep. He returned to the hotel, went to his room, and asked for coffee. The day watchman, and not Yegor, brought it to him. Levin wished to enter into conversation with him, but someone rang for him, and he went out. Then Levin tried to take his coffee, and put a piece of kalach into his mouth, but his mouth did not know what to do with the bread. He eschewed it and put on his overcoat, and went out to walk again. It was just 10:00 when he reached the Shtcherbatskys' steps for the second time. They were beginning to get up. The cook was going to market. he would have to wait at least 2 hours longer. Levin had passed the whole night and the morning completely oblivious of the material conditions of existence. He had neither eaten nor slept, had been exposed, with almost no clothing, to the cold for several hours, and he not only was fresh and hearty, but he was unconscious of his body. He moved without using his muscles, and felt capable of doing anything. He was persuaded that he could fly through the air or jump over the top of a house if it were necessary. He roamed about the streets to pass away the time, consulting his watch every moment or two, and looking about him. What he saw that day he never saw again. He was particularly struck by the children on their way to school, the dark blue pigeons flying from the roof to the sidewalk, the sacks or little cakes powdered with flour that an invisible hand was arranging in a window. These cakes, the pigeons, and the 2 little lads were celestial objects. All this happened at once. One of the little lads ran toward a pigeon and looked at Levin, smiling. The pigeon flapped its wings and flew off glittering in the sunlight through a cloud of fine snow, and the smell of hot bread came through the window where the sacks were displayed. All these things, taken as a whole, produced so lively an impression on Levin that he laughed aloud until the tears came. After going round by the Gazetnya and Kislova streets, he went back to the hotel, sat down, placed his watch before him, and waited till the hands pointed to the hour of noon. In the next room someone was talking about machines and hoaxes, and someone coughed a morning cough. The person did not know that the hour hand was approaching 12. The hour pointed to 12. Levin went to the steps of the hotel. The izvostchiks evidently knew all about it. With happy faces they surrounded him, with eager emulation offering their services. Striving not to offend the others and promising to take them some other time, he made his choice and ordered the man to drive to the Shtcherbatskys'. The izvostchik was charming, with his white shirt-collar above his kaftan surrounding his strong red neck. He had a comfortable sleigh, more comfortable than ordinary sleighs, such a sleigh as Levin had never seen before, and the horse was good and did his best to run, but did not stir from the spot. The izvostchik knew the Shtcherbatsky house. He stopped before the door flourishing his arms and turned respectfully toward Levin, saying "Tprou" to his horse. The Shtcherbatskys' Swiss knew all about it, surely. That was plain from the look in his eyes and the way he said, "Well, it is a long time since you have been here, Konstantin Dmitrich." Not only did he know what had happened, but he was full of delight and tried to conceal his joy. Levin felt a shade happier when he caught the old man's good-natured eyes. "Are they up?" "Please come in. Leave that here," added the Swiss, as Levin was turning back to get his cap. That surely had some significance. "To whom shall I announce you, sir?" asked a lackey. This lackey, though young, new in the house, and with some pretension to elegance, was very obliging, very attentive, and he, too, seemed to understand the situation. "To the princess. I mean the prince." "No, the young princess," replied Levin. The first person whom he met was Mademoiselle Linon. She was passing through the hall, radiant in her little curls and her shining face. He had hardly spoken to her when the rustling of a dress was heard at the door. Mademoiselle Linon disappeared from before his eyes, and a joyous trepidation at the thought of the happiness so near took possession of him. Mademoiselle Linon hastened away and vanished through another door. She had hardly gone when swift light steps were heard pattering on the inlaid floor, and his happiness, his life, the better part of himself, that which he had yearned for so long, drew near. She did not walk. Some invisible power seemed to bring her toward him. He saw only her bright, truthful eyes, filled with the same timid joy of love that filled his own heart. These eyes, shining nearer and nearer to him, almost blinded him with their light of love. She stood before him, almost touching him. Then she placed her 2 hands gently on his shoulders. She did all she could. She went to him. She gave herself to him, trembling and happy. He folded her in his arms and pressed his lips to hers, expectant of his kiss. She, too, had not slept at all that night. She had been waiting for him all the morning. Her parents were perfectly agreed and happy in her happiness. She had been on watch for his coming. She wanted to be the first to tell him of their happiness. She was prepared to meet him alone, and she was full of joy at the thought, and yet she was shy and confused, and hardly knew what she was going to do. She had heard his steps and voice, and hid herself behind the door to wait till Mademoiselle Linon had gone. Mademoiselle Linon went. Then, without any delay, without questioning further, she came to him and did as she did. "Now, let us find mamma," said she, taking his hand. For a long time he could not utter a word, not so much because he was afraid of lessening the intensity of his joy by words, but because every time he tried to say anything he felt that instead of words, tears of joy burst forth. His tears choked him. He took her hand and kissed it. "Is it really true?" he said at last in a husky voice. "I cannot believe that you love me." She smiled at the way he used the second person singular, and at the timidity with which he looked at her. "Yes," she replied, slowly lingering on this word. "I am so happy." Without letting go his hand, she went with him into the drawing-room. As soon as the princess saw them, she began to breathe fast, and then burst into tears, and then she laughed, and with an energetic movement which Levin was not prepared for, she ran to him, seized his head, and kissed him, bedewing his face with her tears. "So all is settled? I am delighted. Love her. I am so glad. For you. Kitty." "It didn't take you long to arrange matters," said the old prince, trying to appear calm, but Levin saw his eyes were full with tears as he looked at him. "It is something I have long been anxious for," said the prince, taking Levin's hand and drawing him toward him. "And even when this little giddy pate thought—" "Papa!" cried Kitty, putting her hand over his mouth. "Well, I won't say anything," said he. "I am very, very Ach, how stupid I am!" And he took Kitty in his arms, kissed her face, her hands, and then her face again, blessing her with the sign of the cross. And Levin was filled with a new feeling of affection for the old prince, when he saw how tenderly and fervently Kitty kissed his great, strong hand. End of chapter 15. The princess was sitting in her easy-chair, silent and beaming. The prince was sitting beside her. Kitty was standing near her father, holding his hand. All of them were silent. The princess was the first to bring their thoughts and feelings back to the affairs of real life, and the transition gave each of them, for a moment, a strange and painful impression. "When shall the wedding be? We must announce the marriage, and have them betrothed, but when shall the wedding be? What do you think about it, Alexander?" "There is the person most interested," said the prince, pointing to Levin. "When?" replied the latter, reddening. "Tomorrow, if you wish my opinion. Today, the betrothal. Tomorrow, the wedding." There, that'll do, mon cher. No nonsense." "Well, in a week then." "One would really suppose that you had lost your senses." "But why not?" "Mercy on us," said the mother, smiling gaily at his impatience. "And the trousseau?" "Is it possible that a trousseau and all the rest are indispensable?" thought Levin, with alarm. "However, neither the trousseau, nor the betrothal, nor anything else can spoil my happiness. Nothing can do that." He looked at Kitty and noticed that the idea of the trousseau did not offend her at all. "It must be very necessary," he said to himself. "I admit that I know nothing about it. I have merely expressed my desire," said he, excusing himself. "We will consider the matter. Now we will have the betrothal and announce the marriage. That is what we will do." The princess stepped up to her husband, kissed him, and was about to move away again, but he held her and kissed her again and again, like a young lover. The two old people seemed agitated and ready to believe that it was not their daughter who was to be married, but themselves. When the prince and princess had gone out, Levin approached his fiancée and took her hand. He had regained his self-possession and could speak. He had many other things on his mind to tell her, but he did not say at all what he intended to say. "I knew that it would be like this. At the bottom of my heart I was sure of it, without ever daring to hope. I believe that it was predestined." "And I," replied Kitty, "even when—" she hesitated, then continued, looking at him resolutely out of her sincere eyes. "Even when I rejected my happiness, I never loved anybody but you. I was led away. I ought to tell you. I must ask you. Can you forget it?" "Perhaps it was best that it should be so. You, too, will have to pardon me, for I must confess to you." This was one of the things he had on his mind to tell her. He had decided to confess everything to her, from his earliest life. First, that he was not so pure as she, and then that he was not a believer. This was cruel, but he thought it his duty to make these confessions to her. "No, not now. Later," said he. "Very well, later. But be sure to tell me. I am not afraid of anything. I want to know all, everything, now it is decided." "Is it decided," he interrupted, "that you take me just as I am? You do not take back your word?" "No. Oh, no." Their conversation was interrupted by Mademoiselle Linon, who, trying to look properly serious, came to congratulate her favourite pupil. She had not left the drawing-room before the servants came to offer their congratulations. Next came the relatives and friends, and this was the beginning of that absurdly happy period from which Levin did not emerge till the day after his marriage. Although he felt constrained and ill at ease all the time, yet the force of his happiness kept increasing. He felt all the time that much which he knew nothing about would be required of him, and he did everything that he was told to do, and all this served to increase his joy. He imagined that his engagement would not be in the least like others, that the ordinary conditions of an engagement would destroy his especial happiness. But it came about that he did exactly as everybody else did in such cases, and his happiness for this very reason kept increasing, and grew more and more peculiar, and did not change, and was in no respect like that of other men. "Now," said Mademoiselle Linon, "we shall have all the candy we wish for." And Levin ran to buy candy. "Well, very glad," said Sviazhsky. "I advise you to get your bouquets at Fomin's." "Do you?" said Levin, and he went to Fomin's. His brother told him he would have to borrow money because there would be many expenses for presents and other things. "For presents? Really?" And he started off on the run to buy jewelry at Fulda's. At the confectioner's, at Fomin's, at Fulda's, he found that every one expected him, and every one seemed glad and rejoiced in his happiness, as did every one with whom he had to do those days. It was an extraordinary thing that not only did they all love him, but, strange as it may seem, even those who before had seemed cold, unsympathetic, and indifferent approved of him in every way, treated his feelings with delicacy and gentleness, and shared his convictions that he was the happiest man in the world, because his bride was the pink of perfection. Kitty also had the same feeling. When the Countess Nordstone alluded to the more brilliant hopes that she had conceived for her friend, Kitty became angry, and declared so vehemently that no one in the world could be better than Levin, that the Countess had to confess it, and when Kitty was present she never met Levin without smiling enthusiastically. The confession which he had promised was a very trying incident of this period. He consulted the old prince, and, acting on his advice, Levin gave Kitty his journal in which were written out all the matters that troubled him. He had written this diary purposely to show to the one whom he should marry. 2 things tormented him: his sins against virtue and his unbelief. The confession of his unbelief passed almost unnoticed. She was religious, and had never doubted the truth of her religion, but her lover's superficial skepticism did not trouble her very much. She knew through love his whole soul, and in his soul found all that she wanted. It was of little importance to her that he termed the state of his soul incredulity. But the second acknowledgment caused her to shed bitter tears. Levin had a great struggle with himself before he decided to let her read his diary. He knew that between him and her there could be and should be no secrets, and therefore he resolved that he must do it, but he did not realize what an effect it would have on a young girl. Only when, as he entered Kitty's room one evening before going to the theatre, and saw her lovely face bathed in tears, and unhappy with the irreparable woe that he had caused, did he perceive the abyss that separated his shameful past from her dove-like purity, and he was horror-stricken at what he had done. "Take back these terrible papers! Take them back!" she said, pushing away the sheets lying on the table. "Why did you give them to me? However, perhaps it was for the best," she added, seized with pity at the sight of Levin's despairing face. "But it is terrible, terrible!" He hung his head and had nothing to say. "You will not forgive me," he murmured. "Yes, I have forgiven you, but it is terrible." However, his happiness was so immense that this confession did not diminish it, but only served to add a shade more to it. She forgave him. From that time he counted himself still more unworthy of her. Morally he bowed down still lower before her, and treasured the happiness that he had gained still higher. He understood the worth of it still better after this pardon. End of chapter 16.